close your eyes and let the sounds of the modern world fade into the soft grey silence of a medieval dawn, imagining yourself standing on the banks of the River Seine in the year 1307, where the air is thick with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and the cold, mineral tang of the river water lapping against ancient stones, while the city of Paris sleeps under a blanket of October mist that muffles the footsteps of the night watch and hides the towers of the great cathedral in a ghostly haze. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. The city is quiet, but it is a deceptive quiet, the kind that holds its breath before a thunderclap. For in the narrow, winding streets, shadowy figures are moving with purpose, men in leather and chainmail whose breath steams in the chill air as they grip the hilts of their swords and clutch sealed parchments stamped with the heavy wax seal of the king. It is Friday, the 13th of October, a date that hangs in our collective memory like a spider web, though in 1307 it was just another autumn morning, or at least it was supposed to be, until the church bells began to ring, not for prayer, but as a backdrop to one of the most meticulously executed police raids in human history. To understand the sheer magnitude of what is happening in this half-light, we must appreciate the silence that preceded it. For weeks earlier, on the 14th of September, royal couriers had ridden out from the Louvre palace like blood cells pumping through the veins of the kingdom, carrying orders to officials in every corner of France, from the stormy coasts of Normandy to the sun-baked vineyards of Languedoc, with strict instructions that the seals were not to be broken until this precise morning. It was a feat of bureaucratic synchronization that would be impressive in the age of the internet, let alone in an age of muddy roads and slow horses, revealing the terrifying efficiency of King Philip IV's government, a machine that moved with the cold logic of a clock. As the sun struggles to pierce the fog, the king's agent in Paris, Guillaume de Nogaret, a man with a lawyer's mind and an executioner's soul, steps up to the imposing gates of the Temple, the fortified headquarters of the Knights Templar in France. The Temple is not merely a church, but a city within a city, a sprawling complex of high walls, treasuries and gardens where the Templars live under their own laws, immune to the king's justice and answering only to the Pope in distant Rome. Inside, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, is likely sleeping or perhaps rising for the early office of matins, his mind troubled by rumours but surely feeling safe in the heart of Christendom. For just the day before, he had walked beside the king at a royal funeral, holding one of the cords of the pall, a position of highest honour that suggested nothing was amiss. There is a profound and tragic irony in this image of the old warrior, comfortable in the favour of the monarch who was secretly sharpening the knife, a reminder that in the courts of medieval Europe, a smile was often just a baring of teeth in disguise. Suddenly, the peace is shattered as the royal guards demand entry, not with a polite knock, but with the weight of royal authority, swarming into the courtyard and dragging the knights from their beds, confusing these men who are accustomed to waking to the call of prayer, not the shout of arrest. It is worth noting that while we imagine the Templars as fierce warriors in gleaming armour, the men inside the Paris Temple on this morning are largely aging administrators, accountants, and veterans whose fighting days are long behind them. Men who manage the vast banking network of the order rather than charge into battle. Resistance is futile and perhaps a bit undignified before breakfast. There is perhaps nothing quite so disorienting as being arrested before one has had a chance to properly break one's fast, and history is often made by men who are simply grumpy from lack of sleep. Within hours, the impossible has happened. The untouchable soldiers of God are in chains. The shock that ripples through the city as the Parisians wake up is absolute, for the Templars have been a fixture of life for nearly 2 centuries, the ultimate defenders of the Holy Land, the guardians of the road to Jerusalem, and the trusted bankers who hold the deposits of merchants and nobles alike. To see them dragged through the streets like common criminals is as jarring as if the sky had suddenly turned green. As the knights are herded into carts and taken to various prisons, including the towers of their own temple, which has now become their dungeon, the king's heralds are already crying out the accusations in the public squares, a list of crimes so grotesque and shocking that they are designed to bypass reason and strike directly at the gut. They claim the knights deny Christ, that they spit on the cross during their initiation ceremonies, that they worship a bearded head called Baphomet, and that they engage in unnatural acts with one another in the dark, a smear campaign of such breathless intensity that it feels strikingly modern in its manipulation of public outrage. Historians still argue whether there was any kernel of truth to these wild charges, perhaps some hazing rituals that had grown out of hand, or secret initiations meant to test a recruit's obedience, but the consensus remains that the charges were largely a fabrication, a dark fantasy woven by the king's ministers to justify the seizure of the order's immense wealth and the destruction of a power that threatened the king's absolute sovereignty. As the mist lifts and the pale autumn sun finally illuminates the streets of Paris, the reality sets in. The temple has fallen, not to a Saracen army, but to a lawyer's writ and a king's greed. Jacques de Molay, the godfather of the king's own daughter, sits in a cold cell, his world overturned, trying to comprehend how the protector of the faith has become its prisoner. This is the first act of a tragedy that will take 7 years to unfold, a slow-motion car crash of dynasty and divinity that begins here, with the slamming of iron doors. The success of the raid is total, a clean sweep that leaves no room for escape. And as the news travels outward from Paris, spreading panic to the commanderies in the countryside, the King of France sits in his palace, likely looking out a window with that famous, unreadable expression of his, watching the smoke of the morning fires rise, knowing that he has just declared war not on an enemy army, but on the papacy, on tradition, and perhaps on God himself. The eerie silence of the morning has been replaced by the scratching of quills as interrogators prepare their questions, and the heavy thud of boots in the corridors of power, marking the end of the age of crusading knights and the beginning of the age of the absolute state. The air in Paris feels different now, charged with a strange electricity, a static tension that makes the hair on the back of one's neck stand up, as if the city itself knows that a line has been crossed from which there is no return. In the shadows of the Louvre, Philip the Fair turns away from the window, his beautiful, terrible face composed, ready to begin the next phase of his dismantling of the old world, and it is to him, the statue who breathes, that we must now turn our attention to understand the mind that could conceive of such a Friday, to understand the hand that cast the net. We must leave the chaotic streets of Paris and step into the unnatural stillness of the palace of the Cité, moving through the heavy oak doors into the presence of the man who sits at the centre of the web, King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair or Philippe le Bel. He is, without exaggeration, one of the most beautiful men to ever wear a crown, a figure so striking that he seems less like a flesh and blood monarch and more like a stained glass window that has miraculously stepped down from a cathedral wall. He is tall, towering over his courtiers, with hair the colour of spun gold and eyes of a startling icy blue that seem to look right through you, past your secrets and into the wall behind you. Yet, as you stand before him in the hushed throne room, where the only sound is the crackle of the hearth and the nervous shifting of velvet slippers on stone, you realize that his beauty is a kind of armor, a polished surface that reveals absolutely nothing of the mind working beneath it. His contemporaries found him unnerving, even terrifying. The Bishop of Pamiers, a man who dared to oppose him and paid the price, famously spat that Philip was neither a man nor a beast, but a statue, a description that captures the eerie, breathless quality of his presence. He rarely speaks, and when he does, his voice is soft, brief, and utterly final, lacking the booming rage of his ancestors, but carrying a chill that freezes the blood faster than any shout. It is said that he would simply stare at ambassadors in silence for minutes on end, a tactic that caused hardened diplomats to stammer, sweat, and eventually agree to things they had never intended to concede, proving that in the Game of Thrones, awkward silence is a weapon far more potent than a sword. Historians still argue, with a passion that spans centuries, about what lay behind that marble face. Was Philip a genius of statecraft, the first true architect of modern France who used his ministers like tools? Or was he, as some suggest, a crowned ass, a hollow vessel filled with the malice of his aggressive lawyers, men like Guillaume de Nogaret, who did the dirty work while the king maintained his pious facade? The truth, as it often does, likely floats somewhere in the twilight between these extremes. What is certain is that Philip viewed himself not merely as a king, but as a sacred instrument of God, the grandson of St. Louis, carrying a divine mandate that placed the welfare of France above all other laws, including those of the Church. He was a paradox wrapped in ermine, a man who wore a hair shirt next to his skin to mortify his flesh, yet who sanctioned the torture of priests, a devoted husband who loved his wife, Joan of Navarre, with a rare and singular intensity, yet whose heart seemed closed to almost everyone else. He is the first modern bureaucrat king, a man who prefers the ink-stained ledger to the bloody battlefield, though he is not afraid of war. He is simply afraid of paying for it. And this brings us to the great gnawing hunger that defines his reign and drives the tragedy of the Templars, the desperate, crushing need for gold. France is rich, but the king is poor, drained by endless grinding conflicts with England and the stubborn, muddy wars in Flanders that swallow armies and treasure in equal measure. To fill his empty coffers, Philip has tried everything, turning his kingdom into a laboratory of frantic economic experiments. He has taxed the Jews and then expelled them, seizing their property in a grim rehearsal for what is to come. He has taxed the Italian bankers, squeezing the Lombards until they fled. He has even debased the currency, ordering the royal mints to mix cheaper metals into the silver coins, a move that earned him the whispered nickname the Counterfeiter King, and caused inflation to spiral so wildly that the price of bread could change between the time a man entered a bakery and the time he reached the counter. This financial wizardry had real consequences. In 1306, just a year before the Templar raid, the people of Paris, enraged by the worthless coin and soaring rents, rose up in a violent riot that surged toward the palace. In a supreme twist of irony that surely planted the seed of the future betrayal, Philip was forced to flee his own home and seek sanctuary in the one place in Paris strong enough to hold back the mob, the Temple. Imagine the scene. The King of France, humiliated and pale, hurrying through the gates of the Knights Templar, the very men he would later condemn as heretics. For several days, he lived as a guest of the order, eating their bread, sleeping behind their massive walls, and most importantly, looking at their vaults. The temple was not just a fortress, it was the most secure bank in Europe, a place where popes and kings stored their reserves. As Philip walked the stone corridors, ostensibly a refugee, his statue eyes must have taken in the sheer scale of the Templar operation, the chests of silver, the efficient clerks managing transfers to Jerusalem, the power that hummed in the air like a hive. He saw an imperium in imperio, a state within a state, rich, autonomous, and arrogantly independent. To a man obsessed with the absolute sovereignty of the French crown, the Templars were not just a temptation, they were an insult. They were a relic of an older world where power was shared with the church, and Philip was a man who did not like to share. It is easy to imagine that it was there, in the safety of the temple, that the gratitude of the guest curdled into the calculation of the predator. He realized that with a one stroke he could wipe out his debts to the order, for he owed them vast sums, and seize their treasury to fund his ambitions. But to strike at the Templars, the soldiers of the Pope, required a lever longer than simple greed. It required a cause so terrifying that it would paralyze any defence. And so, as he sits in his solar now, the morning after the raid, Philip is not merely counting coins, he is crafting a narrative. He relies on his new men, the lawyers of low birth but high ambition who hate the old aristocracy and the church's privileges. They whisper to him that the Templars are rotten, a cancer in the body of France, and Philip, the grandson of a saint, convinces himself that his greed is actually piety, that by destroying the order he is cleansing the realm of God. It is a terrifying form of self-deception, the kind that allows a man to burn others while believing he is holding the light. As the sun climbs higher over Paris, warming the cold stone of the palace, the king remains motionless, a sphinx in royal purple. He knows that the letters have been sent, the trap has snapped shut, and the world has changed. He does not smile. Statues, after all, have no need for expressions, and besides, the game is far from won. The Pope in the south has yet to move, and the fires have yet to be lit. But for now, the king waits, his patience as deep and cold as the ocean, while across the city, the vaults of the temple are being forced open, and the gold that failed to save the knights begins to flow toward the Louvre. To understand why the King of France would risk his immortal soul to crush a holy order, we must turn our gaze from the cold face of Philip to the object of his desire, stepping through the smashed gates of the Paris temple and descending into the cool, stone-lined belly of the donjon, where the air smells of old parchment, beeswax, and the metallic tang of silver. Here, in the dim light of flickering torches, lies the answer to the mystery, stacked in heavy oak chests, reinforced with iron bands, the treasure of the Templars. But this treasure is not merely a pile of pirated gold or stolen gems. It is the engine of a financial empire so sophisticated that it makes the royal treasury look like a child's piggy bank. It is strange to think that this colossal banking conglomerate began in the most humble way imaginable in the dusty, sun-bleached streets of Jerusalem around the year 1199, when a French nobleman named Hugues de Payan and 8 companions swore an oath to protect pilgrims on the dangerous road from Jaffa. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and the emphasis was heavily on the word poor. Legend says they were so destitute that Hugues and his companion had to ride on a single horse, an image later stamped onto their official seal, a symbol of brotherhood that by 1307 must have looked almost comical to the Parisians watching Templar grandees ride by on charges worth a peasant's lifetime wages. Over 2 centuries, this band of roadside bodyguards transformed into the first multinational corporation in history, a shift driven by a brilliant solution to a terrifying problem. A pilgrim travelling from London or Paris to Jerusalem faced thousands of miles of bandits, pirates, and corrupt toll collectors, making it suicidal to carry bags of gold coin. The Templars, with their network of fortified commanderies stretching across Christendom like a string of stone pearls, invented a system that borders on magic, A man could deposit his gold at the temple in London, receive a coded slip of parchment, a letter of credit, and then travel light, carrying only his clothes and his faith. When he arrived in Jerusalem months later, he would present his parchment to the Templar treasurer there, who would decode the cipher and hand him back his money in local currency, minus a reasonable transaction fee. It was the medieval ancestor of the ATM and the traveller's cheque, a stroke of logistical genius that turned the order into the safest way to move value across the world. By the time Philip the Fair was staring greedily at their walls, the Templars were no longer just knights. They were the bankers of Europe, managing the accounts of popes, holding the crown jewels of kings as collateral, and lending vast sums to monarchs who, like Philip, had a bad habit of spending more than they earned. Inside the Paris temple, the atmosphere is less like a monastery and more like a high-end law firm mixed with a fortress. Scribes in wool robes sit in rows, their quills scratching furiously as they update ledgers that track loans to wool merchants in Flanders and spice traders in Venice, while silent brothers move bags of coins with the casual efficiency of men who have seen so much gold it no longer excites them. Historians still argue whether this immense wealth actually corrupted the Templars spiritually. Were they greedy or simply efficient? But it is undeniable that their success created a dangerous optical illusion. To the outsider, they looked like hypocrites, men who had taken vows of poverty, yet lived in palaces and controlled the flow of millions. It is a peculiar irony of history that the Templars' greatest service to the West, their invention of modern banking, became the very thing that made them intolerable to a cash-strapped king. There is a dark humour in the fact that these warrior monks, trained to kill with the sword, were ultimately brought down because they were too good at accounting. They had become the creditors to a man who had the power to cancel his debts by cancelling his lenders. As the royal officers ransacked the archives on this fateful morning, overturning tables and breaking open strong boxes, they are looking for the fabled Templar treasure, imagining heaps of rubies and chalices. What they find instead is something far more modern and perhaps disappointing to a looting soldier: debt notes, mortgages, and complex financial instruments. The true wealth of the Templars was not in a pile of coins that could be easily seized, but in the trust and the flow of credit that relied on the order's existence, a delicate web that Philip was now tearing apart with his heavy hands. The king, in his desperation, failed to understand that by arresting the bankers, he was not just stealing their gold. He was smashing the mechanism that kept the economy of Europe greased. Yet, for all their financial acumen, the Templars had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed their money and their service to the church made them untouchable. They forgot that gold is heavy, and that a man carrying too much of it can drown if the waters rise fast enough. In the silence of the vault, as the dust settles from the raid, the open chests seem to gape like mouths, testifying to the end of an era where faith and finance could coexist without suspicion. The poor fellow soldiers had become the masters of the world's coin, and in doing so, they had painted a target on their own backs, one that shone brighter than the red crosses on their mantles. As the last of the ledgers is tossed into a royal sack, the spirit of the order, that strange blend of mystic warrior and pragmatic banker, begins to evaporate, leaving behind only the cold, hard arithmetic of a king who has finally found a way to balance his books. Leaving the stone-cold vaults of Paris behind, we let the narrative drift south, carried on the invisible currents of the wind, over the rolling vineyards of Burgundy, and down the rushing waters of the Rhone, until the grey skies of the north give way to the sharp, brilliant light of Provence. Here the air smells of wild thyme, sun-baked dust, and the dry, restless energy of the Mistral wind, which scours the landscape and rattles the shutters of the houses. In this brighter, warmer world, we find a man who is shivering, not from cold, but from a profound and sickly dread. He is Bertrand de Goux, known to the world as Pope Clement V, the Vicar of Christ and the shepherd of all Christendom, though at this moment he looks less like a shepherd and more like a sheep who has just realised the wolves are running the farm. In 1507, the papacy is in a state of strange dislocation. Clement has not settled in Rome, the eternal home of the apostles, but wanders through southern France, eventually drifting toward the town of Avignon, beginning what history will famously call the Babylonian captivity of the church. He is a man of fragile health, constantly plagued by stomach pains and a constitution that seems to crumple under stress. An unfortunate trait for a man whose job description involves managing the spiritual welfare of an entire continent while dodging the political arrows of kings. If Philip the Fair is a statue, Clement the Farfif is a willow branch, bending wildly in every storm, desperately trying not to snap. When the news of the Templars' arrest reaches him, carried by messengers whose horses are frothing from the hard ride from Paris, Clement is reportedly furious. His anger, however, is not necessarily born of a moral certainty about the Templars' innocence, but from a stinging professional insult. Philip has arrested the Pope's own soldiers, men who answer only to the Church without so much as a "by your leave" or a polite heads up. It is a jurisdiction violation of the highest order, like a CEO walking into a rival company and firing the entire security staff just to make a point. Clement realizes immediately that this is not just about the knights, it is a direct challenge to the authority of the Holy See. He writes a blistering letter to Philip, demanding to know by what right the king dares to touch the property and persons of the church, a letter that surely felt brave as he dictated it, but likely caused his hand to tremble as he signed it. For Clement knows, deep in his gut, the same gut that gives him so much trouble, that he owes his tiara to Philip. He was elected after a deadlock, a compromise candidate who was acceptable to the French, and ever since, the king has treated him less like a holy father and more like a majestic, slightly troublesome chaplain. The relationship between these two men is the pivot upon which the fate of the Templars turns, and it is a relationship defined by a terrifying asymmetry of will. Philip is relentless, a force of nature who does not blink. Clement is a diplomat, a lawyer by training who believes that every problem can be solved with a committee, a delay, and a carefully worded subclause. Historians still argue whether Clement was truly a weak collaborator who sacrificed the Templars to save his own skin, or a cunning strategist who was playing a desperate game of chess against a grand master, trying to use legal procedure to shield the order from the king's wrath. There is evidence that he tried to slow the process down, to take the investigation out of the hands of the king's brutal inquisitors and bring it under church control, hoping that the delay would allow passions to cool or the king to be distracted by another war. But Philip does not get distracted. He responds to the Pope's protests with a campaign of psychological warfare that is breathless in its cruelty. He unleashes his lawyers to whisper that perhaps the Pope himself is soft on heresy, that perhaps a man who defends devil-worshipping knights is not fit to sit on the throne of St. Peter. It is a thinly veiled threat of deposition, a reminder that what a king can help build, a king can also tear down. One can almost see Clement pacing the floors of his residence, wrapped in heavy furs, despite the mild climate, sipping herbal broths and staring at the piles of documents that accuse the Templars of spitting on the cross. He is a man trapped in a nightmare of bureaucracy and blackmail. He knows the charges are likely absurd. The idea that the Grand Master, a man so pious he was almost boring, was secretly a heretic seems laughable, but the confessions are coming in, extracted by fire and the rack, and they are legally binding. Clement is caught between his duty to justice and his fear of a schism. If he pushes Philip too hard, the king might simply break the French church away from Rome entirely, a catastrophe that would shatter Christendom. So, the Pope dithers. He forms commissions. He calls for more inquiries. He tries to wrap the king in a blanket of red tape, hoping to suffocate the fire, but Philip just cuts through it with the sword. There's a touch of dark absurdity to the situation. The most powerful spiritual figure on earth, spending his days trying to find a loophole that will stop his most Christian king from burning his most dedicated monks. It is in this period that the tragedy of Clement becomes palpable. He is not a villain, but a man outmatched by the brutality of his times. He seeks refuge in the small pleasures of his court, in the acquisition of art and the comfort of his family, surrounding himself with nephews whom he promotes to cardinals in a display of nepotism that raises eyebrows even in the 14th century. He is trying to build a fortress of familiar faces against the cold wind coming from Paris. Yet every courier from the north brings fresh demands. The king wants the Templars condemned. He wants their property transferred. He wants the memory of his old enemy, Pope Boniface VIII, to be dug up and put on trial for heresy. A grotesque demand that Philip uses as a bargaining chip, essentially saying, "Give me the Templars, and I will stop harassing the corpse of your predecessor." Clement, exhausted and cornered, begins to concede, inch by painful inch. He issues the bull Pastoralis Prae Eminentiae, ordering the arrest of Templars in all other kingdoms of Europe, effectively sanctioning Philip's raid retroactively. It is a moment of profound capitulation, a signal to the world that the sword of the king is now longer than the crook of the shepherd. The sun sets over the Rhone, casting long violet shadows across the papal apartments, and the wind dies down, leaving a heavy silence. Clement sits by his fire, the weight of the tiara pressing down on his temples like a band of iron. He must wonder, in the quiet of the night, if he has already damned himself. The tragedy of the Templars is not just about the knights who will burn. It is about the institutions that failed them, the slow, agonizing collapse of moral courage in the face of raw power. Clement V will go down in history not as the man who led the church to a new golden age, but as the man who let the King of France hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven, or at least the keys to the treasury. And while he sits in his gilded cage in the south, far to the north, in the damp dungeons of France, the brothers of the temple are waiting for a help that is unravelling, thread by thread, in the trembling hands of a sick old man. The distance between Avignon and Paris has never felt so vast, nor the road so impassable. The narrative now descends from the sun-drenched terraces of Avignon, dropping down through the heavy layers of the earth into the suffocating darkness of the Parisian dungeons, where the air is stagnant and cold, smelling of wet straw, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear. It is here, in the subterranean silence beneath the bustling streets, that the once proud Knights Templar are being systematically dismantled, not by swords, but by the terrifying machinery of the Inquisition. The king has handed the prisoners over to the Dominicans, the hounds of the Lord, friars who specialise in the extraction of truth, or what passes for truth, through the application of pain. We must tread carefully here, for the reality of the torture chamber is not a bedtime story, yet we can observe it through the lens of history's sorrow, rather than its gore, focusing on the tragedy of the spirit, rather than the breaking of the bone. Imagine the bewilderment of these men, many of them elderly veterans who had spent their youth under the blazing sun of the Levant, fighting against the enemies of the faith, only to find themselves stripped of their mantles and chained to the walls by their own countrymen, accused of crimes so bizarre they sound like fever dreams. They are accustomed to the brutality of the battlefield, to the clean cut of a scimitar or the impact of a lance, but they are utterly unprepared for the intimate psychological violence of the dungeon, where a man is not allowed to die with honor, but is instead kept alive to betray himself. The inquisitors are methodical, cold, and terrifyingly patient. They do not shout, they simply ask over and over again the same questions from a prepared list. Did you deny Christ? Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship the idol? When the answers are no, the instruments are brought forward, the rack, the strappado, the burning of feet, and the questions are asked again. It is a process designed to shatter the will, to make the prisoner feel that God has already left the room, and that the only way to stop the pain is to give the questioner exactly what he wants to hear. Historians still argue about the speed and uniformity of the Templar collapse. Within weeks, hundreds of knights, including the Grand Master himself, had confessed to the most grotesque heresies. Some scholars suggest this proves there was a rot at the core of the order, a secret subculture of blasphemy. But the more compassionate and likely view is that these men were simply broken by a system they could not comprehend. They were soldiers, not theologians or lawyers, and when faced with the combined authority of the king and the church, coupled with the agony of the rack, their resistance crumbled like dry clay. There is a heartbreaking logic to their confessions. They all admitted to exactly the same details: spitting on the cross near the altar, receiving an obscene kiss at the base of the spine, details that match the Inquisitor's questionnaires perfectly, suggesting that the knights were not recalling memories but reciting a script fed to them between screams. It is the first great show trial in Western history, a prototype for the witch trials and political purges of later centuries, where the verdict is decided before the prisoner even enters the room. Among the shadows, the figure of Jacques de Molay stands out in tragic relief. The old Grand Master, who should have been the rock upon which the order stood, cracked under the pressure. Perhaps it was the fear of pain, or perhaps, as some sympathetic chroniclers suggest, he was tricked, told by the king's agents that if he just admitted to a few minor infractions, the king would be lenient and the order would be saved. Whatever the reason, his confession was a devastating blow, a signal to the rest of the knights that all was lost. If the father of the family had admitted to the sin, what hope did the children have? The psychological shock of seeing their leader bow his head and speak the lies must have been more painful than the iron cuffs on their wrists. And so the confession spread like a contagion, a wave of self-incrimination that flowed from the cells of Paris to the provincial prisons, creating a mountain of parchment filled with truths that were bought with blood. Yet, in the quiet moments between the interrogations, when the torturers have gone to their dinners and the torches burn low, one can imagine the profound spiritual crisis of the knights. They are men who dedicated their lives to a sacred vow, and now they are being forced to desecrate that vow to save their broken bodies. They pray in the dark, whispering to a God who seems to have turned his back, wondering if perhaps they are guilty, if perhaps their pride was a sin that demanded this purgation. The dungeon becomes a crucible where reality melts. Days bleed into nights, and the only certainty is the sound of the guard's footsteps and the scratching of the scribe's quill, recording every stuttered yes as a triumph of justice. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that many of these men were illiterate. They could not read the Latin transcripts they were forced to sign with a shaky X, unaware that they were signing their own death warrants and the death warrant of their brotherhood. Outside the prison walls, the king's propaganda machine is working at full capacity, reading these confessions to the horrified crowds in the gardens of the royal palace. The people of Paris, who had once looked at the Templars with a mix of envy and respect, now recoil in disgust, their minds filled with images of black magic and sodomy. Philip has successfully turned the heroes of the Crusades into monsters, and he has done it using their own voices. But deep in the stone belly of the prison, the embers of resistance are not entirely extinguished. A few knights, those with stronger constitutions or perhaps less to lose, refuse to speak, maintaining their innocence through the agony, dying in silence on the cold floors. Their bodies are quietly removed, buried in unmarked graves, their courage unrecorded by the king's clerks. These silent martyrs are the ghost notes in the historical record, the only ones who defeated the king's narrative simply by refusing to participate in it. As the weeks drag on and the winter of 1307 deepens, the dungeons of France are filled with a strange, murmuring choir of the damned, thousands of men who have lost their honour, their wealth, and their freedom, trapped in a nightmare where the only way out is to agree that they are devils. The king has his evidence, sealed in wax and stained with tears, but the story is not yet over, for truth, even when buried under a mountain of lies, has a way of haunting the men who buried it, and a secret parchment is making its way to a castle on the Loire that will complicate everything Philip thinks he has won. We leave the suffocating darkness of the Parisian dungeons and travel southwest, following the meandering course of the Loire until it feeds into the darker, swifter waters of the river Vienne. Here, rising like a jagged crown of white stone above the slate roofs of the town, stands the Chateau of Chinon. It is the summer of 1308, nearly a year since the initial arrests, and the air here is different. Less heavy with the smog of the capital, sweet with the scent of the surrounding vineyards and the damp, cool breath of the river. But inside the castle, the atmosphere is just as stifling. In the high towers of this fortress, the great officers of the temple, Jacques de Molay and his highest lieutenants, are being held, separated from the rank and file, isolated in a stone limbo. They are the prize prisoners, the head of the snake that Philip believes he has cut off. But something quiet and extraordinary is happening here, a secret meeting that history almost forgot, and which remained buried in the Vatican's secret archives until a misfiled document was miraculously rediscovered in the year 2001. This is the story of the Chinon parchment, the ghost document that could have saved the Templars. If only the world had been allowed to see it. The Pope, still writhing in the grip of his conscience, and the king's pressure, has made a desperate tactical move. He has sent 3 of his most trusted cardinals, Berenger Frédol, Etienne de Suisy, and Landolfo Brancacci, to interview the Templar leaders personally. This is not a torture session managed by the king's brutal lawyers. This is an ecclesiastical inquiry conducted by men of the church, men who speak in soft Latin and look at the prisoners, not with hatred, but with a searching, perhaps even sympathetic gaze. Imagine the scene in the castle solar. The windows are open to the summer breeze, but the men sitting on the wooden stools are broken shadows of their former selves. Jacques de Molay, once the peer of monarchs, is now a haggard old man, his beard unkempt, his eyes rimmed with red. He has spent months in solitary confinement, tormented by the memory of his public confession in Paris, where he admitted to crimes he had not committed to stop the pain. Now, faced with the Pope's direct representatives, he has a singular chance to set the record straight, to speak truth to power before the door slams shut forever. The transcript of this meeting, scrawled furiously by Vatican notaries, reveals a heartbreaking intimacy. When the cardinals ask him if the charges are true, if the order truly denies Christ, de Molay does not scream defiance, nor does he repeat the robotic lies of the torture chamber. Instead, he weeps. He admits to negligence, to odd rituals that had crept into the initiation ceremonies. Perhaps a recruit was asked to spit near the cross to test his absolute obedience, a foolish hazing ritual born of barrack room bravado. But he vehemently denies that they were heretics. He speaks of his life in the East, of the brothers who died protecting the Holy Sepulchre. The cardinals, listening to this broken man, make a decision that contradicts everything the King of France is shouting from the rooftops. They decide that these men are not heretics. They are merely sinners, guilty of foolishness and irregularity, but not of apostasy. In a quiet ceremony within the castle walls, the cardinals perform the act that Philip the Fair fears most. They grant Jacques de Molay and his officers absolution. There is a profound, almost electric tension in this moment. The cardinals lay their hands on the heads of the kneeling knights. They recite the ancient formula of forgiveness, reintegrating them into the communion of the Church. In the eyes of God and the Pope, the Templars are no longer damned. They have been shriven. Technically, legally, and spiritually, this should be the end of the persecution. The king's case, built on the assertion that the order is a nest of devil worshippers, has just been dismantled by the Pope's own plenipotentiaries. The chignon parchment is signed, sealed with the heavy leaden bulle of the cardinals, and prepared for transport back to the Pope. It is the golden ticket, the proof of innocence that should free the captives and perhaps allow the order to reform and survive. But here, the heavy hand of history, or rather, the heavy hand of the king, intervenes with a silence that is louder than any shout. The document does not disappear exactly. It simply fades. It is sent to the Pope, who reads it, likely with a mixture of relief and terror. He knows the Templars are not heretics, but he also knows that Philip has an army, and he does not. If Clement releases this news, if he declares the Templars innocent, Philip might make good on his threats to destroy the papacy itself, and so a terrible compromise is born. The chignon parchment is filed away. It enters the labyrinth of the papal archives, mislabeled, pushed into a dark corner, effectively buried alive. The Pope grants the king permission to continue the suppression of the order for the good of the Church, sacrificing the truth to preserve the institution. The absolution at Chignon becomes a non-event, a tree falling in a forest that no one is allowed to hear. For de Molay and his companions, the tragedy is absolute. They likely believe, for a few hopeful weeks, that they have been saved. They have felt the hands of the cardinals. They have heard the words of forgiveness. They wait in their tower for the order of release that never comes. Instead, the silence returns. The guards do not leave. The food does not improve. The seasons turn. The leaves fall from the vineyards of Chignon, and the river turns grey with winter. And slowly, the realization sinks in. The king does not care about the truth, and the Pope is too weak to enforce it. They are still prisoners, and the absolution they hold in their hearts is a secret that will die with them. Historians still argue whether Clement V intended to reveal the parchment later, or if he cynically buried it from the start, but the result is the same. The Chignon absolution remains one of the great what-ifs of the Middle Ages, a flicker of light that was deliberately snuffed out. As we leave the castle of Chignon, looking back at its white towers against the darkening sky, we feel the weight of this lost opportunity. It is the moment when the story shifts from a prosecution to a persecution, from a legal trial to a judicial murder. The king has decided that the Templars must die, not because they are guilty, but because they are inconvenient. And so, the machinery of death, momentarily paused by the conscience of 3 cardinals, begins to grind forward again. The knights are moved from the relative comfort of Chignon back to the grim reality of Paris, unaware that their vindication is gathering dust on a shelf in Avignon. a secret that will sleep for 700 years while their bodies turn to ash. The path is now cleared for the final act, and the king, his patience thinning, is ready to light the fires that will silence the order once and for all. The year is 1310, and a strange spring has come to France, a season where the blossoming of the hawthorn and the greening of the fields is overshadowed by a dark and sudden harvest of human lives. We find ourselves moving away from the secret parchments of Chinon and back into the public glare of Paris, where the situation has shifted from a legal stalemate into open confrontation. For 2 years, the Templars have been rotting in their cells, but a curious thing has happened in the silence. They have found their voices again. Perhaps the shock of the arrest has worn off, or perhaps the sheer injustice of their plight has ignited a spark of the old warrior spirit that once drove them to charge lines of Mamluk cavalry. Whatever the cause, the knights have begun to do the one thing Philip the Fair never expected. They are fighting back. It begins slowly, a murmur in the dungeons that grows into a roar. When the papal commissioners arrive in Paris to conduct a new inquiry, they are stunned to find that the broken men who had confessed to everything are now standing tall, retracting their admissions and demanding to defend the order. They are led by 2 articulate and courageous priests, Pierre de Boulogne and Renaud de Provins, who organize the prisoners into a coherent legal defense. Imagine the scene in the chaotic halls of the bishop's palace. Hundreds of ragged knights, their beards long and their faces pale from years of darkness, clamouring to be heard. They shout that their confessions were torn from them by torture and the terror of torture, that they had been shown the rack and the fire and told that only a lie would save them. Now, they declare, they are ready to speak the truth. The order is innocent, the charges are a fantasy, and the king is a thief. For a brief, shining moment, it seems the tide might turn. The papal commissioners are shaken by the consistency and passion of these denials. If the Templars are allowed to defend themselves in a fair trial, the king's case will collapse. The evidence of torture is written on their bodies, twisted limbs, burn marks, scars that have not healed, and it speaks louder than any lawyer's argument. Philip the Fair, watching from the Louvre, realizes he has made a tactical error. He has allowed the legal process to drag on too long, and in the delay, his victims have remembered who they are. He sees the danger clearly. A public defense of the Templars would not only exonerate the order, but would expose the king himself as a calumniator and a tyrant. To a man who views his own authority as absolute and divine, this is intolerable. And so the statue moves. Philip does not argue with the law, he simply changes the judges. He forces the appointment of a new Archbishop of Sens, a man named Philippe de Marigny, who is the brother of the king's own chief minister. Marigny is not a shepherd. He is a hatchet man in vestments. He arrives in Paris with a clear mandate: end the defence, silence the knights, and finish the job. He invokes a terrifying loophole in canon law, a trap so brutal it catches the breath in one's throat. He declares that any knight who confessed to heresy and then retracted that confession is not a brave man telling the truth, but a relapsed heretic, a man who has returned to his vomit, a soul twice damned. And the punishment for a relapsed heretic is not a trial, it is death. On the morning of May 12th, 1310, the trap is sprung. Marigny convenes his council and swiftly condemns 54 Templars to the flames. There is no appeal, no delay, no mercy. The sentence is to be carried out immediately. Close your eyes and let the horror of the scene wash over you, not as a spectacle of gore, but as a sombre meditation on the cost of integrity. It is a windy afternoon. The location is a field near the convent of Saint-Antoine, outside the walls of Paris. 54 stakes have been driven into the earth, 54 piles of wood and straw have been stacked. The knights are led out in carts, blinking in the sunlight they have not seen for so long. They are not the leadership. They are rank-and-file brothers, men who simply refuse to lie about their faith. The king's officers give them one last chance. Admit the heresy again, confirm the lies, and you can live. You can go back to a monastery and pray out your days, but if you insist on your innocence, you burn. Whatever fear they felt in the torture chambers seems to have evaporated in the open air. History records that not a single one of the 54 men wavered. They climbed onto the pyres with a calm that terrified the executioners. They called out to God and the Virgin Mary, protesting the innocence of their order until the very end. As the torches were applied, the wind whipped the flames carrying the smoke toward the city, a dark signal to the Parisians that the king's justice was being done. But the crowd that gathered was not cheering. They watched in stunned silence, weeping as the prayers of the dying men rose above the crackling of the fire. There was no confession of guilt, no screaming of demons, only the agonizing, dignified death of soldiers who had decided that their souls were worth more than their bodies. The psychological impact of this mass execution is devastating. It is a brutal message sent directly to the hundreds of other knights waiting in prison. Defense is death. To defend the order is to burn. The legal defense led by Pierre de Boulogne collapses overnight. Pierre himself disappears, likely murdered in a dungeon or silenced in some deep oubliette, and the remaining knights, terrified by the fate of their brothers, fall silent. The resistance is broken not by argument, but by sheer overwhelming terror. As the smoke clears over the field of Saint-Antoine, leaving 54 piles of ash to be scattered by the wind, the victory of Philip the Fair seems complete. He has proven that he can kill the body, even if he cannot quite kill the truth. The 54 martyrs of Saint-Antoine are largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the more famous leaders of the order, but they are the tragic heart of this story. They were ordinary men who found, in their final hour, an extraordinary courage, refusing to validate a lie even when the fire was licking at their feet. Their silence now hangs heavy over the kingdom, a mute accusation that will follow Philip for the rest of his days. The king has won his silence, but he has bought it at a price that the medieval mind struggles to reckon with. He has burned saints to prove they were sinners. Night falls on Paris, and the smell of smoke lingers in the streets, seeping into the tapestries of the palace and the curtains of the king's bed. The first act of blood has been committed, and the precedent has been set. The slow camera of our story lingers for a moment on the blackened earth of the field, where the wind whispers through the grass, before panning back to the dark towers of the temple, where the Grand Master still waits. He has heard the news. He knows now what the king is capable of. And as he sits in the dark, Jacques de Molay must realize that his own reckoning is no longer a question of if, but when. The fires of 1310 have burned away the last illusions of justice, leaving only the raw, naked power of the state, and a king who will stop at nothing to bury the past. The smoke from the fires of Saint-Antoine fades into the grey, weeping skies of autumn, and then into the hard, white frost of winter, and as the seasons turn, the story settles into a long, heavy silence. We enter now into the years of the ghost, that strange, stretched-out period between the dramatic burnings of 1310 and the final tragedy of 1314. It is a time when the urgency of the initial raid dissolves into the slow, grinding friction of diplomacy and bureaucracy. For the knights rotting in the dungeons, time loses its shape. Days bleed into weeks, marked only by the shifting of light across the stone floor and the changing temperature of the air that seeps through the arrow slits. But while the prisoners wait, the world outside is moving with the cold, deliberate pace of a glacier. The scene shifts from the muddy banks of the Seine to the ancient city of Vienne, nestled in the valley of the Rhône, far to the south. It is here, in October 1311, that the Great Council of Vienne convenes, a gathering of the Church's most powerful princes, summoned by Pope Clement V to decide the final fate of the Templars. Imagine the atmosphere of this council not as a heated courtroom, but as a theatre of intimidation. The town is packed with cardinals, bishops, and abbots from across Christendom, their red and purple robes brightening the narrow streets, but encircling the town like a ring of iron are the soldiers of the King of France. Philip the Fair has come personally to watch the proceedings, and his presence casts a long shadow over the cathedral where the sessions are held. He does not scream or shout. He simply sits, the statue king, staring at the Pope with those unblinking blue eyes, a silent reminder that the papacy resides in France's pocket. Inside the cathedral, the air is thick with the scent of incense and anxiety. The bishops are uncomfortable. They know the evidence against the Templars is weak, tainted by torture and retracted confessions. Many of them want to hear a defence, they want to let the Templars speak, but the memory of the 54 burning stakes is fresh, and the king is sitting in the front row. And so, on April 3rd, 1312, the hammer falls. But it falls softly, with the rustle of parchment, rather than the clang of a sword. In a solemn session, with the king sitting at his right hand, Pope Clement VI reads the bull, Vox in excelso, a voice from on high. It is a masterpiece of legal evasion. Clement admits that the crimes of the Templars have not been definitively proven by the laws of evidence. He cannot, in good conscience, condemn the order as heretical based on the facts. However, he argues, the reputation of the order is so ruined, the scandal so great, and the rumours so persistent, that it can no longer function as a defender of the faith. Therefore, he suppresses the order not by way of definitive sentence, but by way of apostolic provision. It is a death by administrative fiat. The Templars are not found guilty. They are simply cancelled, dissolved like a failed corporation, wiped from the board of history to remove the scandal from the church. There is a profound melancholy in this moment. The order that had defended the Holy Land for 2 centuries, whose banners had flown over Jerusalem and Acre, whose knights had died by the thousands in the desert sands, is ended not with a bang, but with a lawyer's loophole. The bells of Vienne ring out, signalling the end of the Knights Templar, but there is no joy in their tolling, only the hollow sound of political compromise. The vast property of the order, the castles, the farms, the vineyards, is technically transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' ancient rivals. But Philip the Fair, ever the accountant, manages to extract such enormous fees for his expenses in handling the investigation that he drains much of the wealth before it ever leaves his kingdom. He has killed the goose, and he is busy stripping the golden feathers one by one. Meanwhile, back in the darkness of Paris, Jacques de Molay and his 3 senior lieutenants, Geoffroy de Charnay, Hugues de Pyrot, and Geoffroy de Gonneville, remain in ignorance. They are not told of the bull Vox in excelso. They are not told that their brotherhood no longer exists. They simply continue to wait, aging in the damp silence of their cells. De Molay is now an old man, his body stiff with rheumatism, his mind likely fraying at the edges after 7 years of imprisonment. We can imagine him pacing the small confines of his cell, reciting his prayers, trying to hold on to the memory of who he once was. Does he still dream of the hot wind of Palestine? Does he regret the moment of weakness when he confessed? Or does he still hope, with a desperate, childlike faith, that the Pope will come to save him? The cruelty of this period lies in its quietness. It is the cruelty of neglect. The king has what he wants, the money, and the elimination of a rival power. The Pope has what he wants: the survival of the papacy and the end of the nagging crisis. The prisoners are merely loose ends, human debris left over from the demolition. They are kept alive, fed on bread and water, suspended in a state of suspended animation. The world has moved on. New wars are brewing. New scandals are erupting. The Templar affair is yesterday's news, but history has a way of circling back to its unfinished business. As the year 1313 passes into 1314, the need to tidy up the final details becomes pressing. The king and the pope decide that it is time to close the file on the Grand Master. They assume that Desmoulins and his companions are broken men, husks who will say whatever they are told to say in exchange for a few more years of life in a monastery. They plan a final public spectacle, not an execution, but a sentencing. The stage is set for a day in March 1340. A scaffold is built in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The citizens are summoned to witness the final act of contrition. The script is written. The old men will be brought out. They will confess their crimes one last time to the crowd, and they will be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, to wallow in their shame until they die. It is meant to be a boring, reassuring conclusion to a messy decade, a reassurance that the system works, that the heretics are punished, and that the king is righteous. But as the sun rises on that March morning, chasing the shadows from the gargoyles of Notre Dame, no one realizes that the script is about to be burned. In the silence of his cell, something has shifted in the soul of Jacques de Molay. Perhaps the long years of quiet have clarified his mind. Perhaps the prospect of dying in a dungeon as a liar has become more terrifying than the prospect of dying in the fire as a truth-teller. The silence of the years has not broken him, it has distilled him. He is ready to speak, and when he does, his voice will shatter the peace of the king and the pope forever. The camera lingers on the heavy wooden door of the prison, hearing the key turn in the lock for the last time. The long wait is over. The final journey to the island has begun. The day of the final act dawns with the sky the colour of bruised iron, a fitting canopy for the grim theatre about to unfold in the heart of Paris. It is March 18th, 1314. The square in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame is packed with a restless ocean of bodies, merchants, apprentices, fishwives, and beggars, all jostling for a view of the high wooden scaffold draped in sombre cloth. They have come to see the monsters, the fallen idols, the men whose alleged crimes have fueled gossip for 7 long years. There's a strange energy in the crowd, a mixture of morbid curiosity and heavy fatigue. The Templar affair has dragged on for so long that it has become a part of the city's weather, a low-hanging cloud that refuses to break. On the scaffold sit the 3 cardinals sent by the Pope, resplendent in their red hats, their faces grave with the weight of the scripted conclusion they are about to deliver. Flanking them are the king's soldiers, standing rigid with pikes, and the scribes ready to record the final submission of the heretics. Then the prisoners are led up the stairs. A hush falls over the square, sudden and absolute. The crowd strains to see the monsters, but all they see are 4 broken old men, blinking in the harsh light, their clothes threadbare, their skin pallid from the dungeon's gloom. Jacques de Molay walks with a heavy shuffling step, his beard white and matted, his back bent under the invisible burden of his chains and his shame. Beside him is Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, equally aged and worn. The other 2, Hugues de Peyraud and Geoffroy de Gonville, look at the ground defeated, ready to play their part in the charade. They have been told the terms: confess publicly, confirm the lies one last time, and you will be returned to the mercy of the church to live out your days in the quiet penance of a monastery. It is a lifeline, a way to die in bed rather than in the fire. The cardinals begin the proceedings. They read aloud the crimes, the spitting, the idols, the denials of Christ, and they recite the confessions these men made years ago. The Latin words drift over the silent crowd, a litany of shame. Then, the moment arrives. The cardinals turn to the prisoners and ask them to confirm their guilt before the people of Paris, to seal the deal and accept their sentence of perpetual imprisonment. Hugues de Peyraud and Geoffroy de Gonville mumble their assent, their voices low, broken men desperate for the ordeal to end. They accept the brand of heretic in exchange for life. But when the question is put to the Grand Master, the script suddenly burns. Jacques de Molay lifts his head. He looks out at the sea of faces, at the great stone facade of the cathedral where saints and gargoyles look down in judgment. He looks at the cardinals who expect a whimper, and then, with a voice that is shockingly clear, a voice that seems to regain the resonance of the battlefield command it once held, he speaks. "I think it is only right," he declares, his words cutting through the cold air, "that at a time like this, when my life draws to a close, I should discover the truth. I possess the truth." The cardinals freeze. The scribes stop writing. "I declare," de Molay continues, his voice rising, "before heaven and earth, and with all of you as my witnesses, that I have committed a great crime against God and against my sovereign. But my crime is not the one you charge me with. My crime is that, to save my own life and to escape the excessive tortures of the rack, I lied. I admitted to crimes that the order never committed. The order is pure. The order is holy. The charges are false. I will not add another lie to the first. I renounce my confession. I choose death over a life bought with a lie." Beside him, Geoffroy de Charnay steps forward, emboldened by his master's courage. "And I too," he shouts. "The order is innocent. We are innocent." The square erupts. The crowd gasps. A sound like a sudden intake of breath from thousands of lungs. The cardinals are stunned, their faces draining of colour. This was not in the plan. This is a disaster. They have just been publicly humiliated by the men they were meant to sentence. Flustered and panicked, unable to pass a death sentence themselves without a new trial, they order the provost of Paris to take the men back to prison. They need time to think, to consult the Pope, to figure out how to handle this impossible retraction. But there is one man who does not need time. Across the river, in the palace of the Louvre, the news is brought to Philip the Fair. He is eating his midday meal, or perhaps sitting in council, when the messenger stammers out the news that de Molay has defied him, that the Grand Master has proclaimed the innocence of the temple to the entire city. The statue king finally cracks. For 7 years, he has carefully constructed a legal fiction, and now, in 1 minute, an old man has torn it down. Philip does not consult the church. He does not call for a trial. He does not ask the Pope's permission. In a cold white fury, he issues a command that is terrified in its swiftness. Burn them. Tonight, there is no delay for prayers, no time for the legal niceties that usually surround an execution. The king wants them silenced before the sun rises again. He designates a small muddy spit of land in the Seine, the Ile des Juifs, the island of the Jews, a place visible from the palace gardens but separated by the dark water. Soldiers are sent to drag de Molay and Charny from their cells, not back to the dungeon, but directly to the riverbank. As evening falls, the word spreads like wildfire through the taverns and workshops of Paris. They are burning the Grand Master. The crowds that had dispersed from Notre Dame rushed to the riverbanks, lining the Pont Neuf and the muddy shores. The atmosphere is no longer curious. It is fearful. There is a sense that something sacred is being violated, that the king is moving too fast, stepping beyond the bounds of justice into the realm of vengeance. On the island, the stakes are hastily erected. The wood is piled high. Faggots, of dry vine branches chosen because they burn hot and fast, or perhaps, as some cruel rumours suggest, green wood is mixed in to make the smoke thick and the death slow. Demole and Chani are ferried across the water in a small boat. They are stripped of their clothes down to their shirts. They do not struggle. The fear that had broken them in the torture chamber years ago is gone, replaced by a strange, transcendent calm. They allow themselves to be bound to the stakes. Philip the Fair watches from a window in the palace, or perhaps he stands in the royal gardens, a dark silhouette against the torchlight. He needs to see this. He needs to know that the voice is stopped, but he cannot know that by burning the body, he is about to amplify the voice into a thunderclap that will shake his throne. The soldiers step back with their torches. The wood catches. The flames begin to lick upward, illuminating the faces of the two last Templars against the night sky. The water of the Seine reflects the fire, turning the river into a ribbon of blood. The end of the order has arrived, not in a courtroom, but on a mudbank, in the dark, under the eyes of a king who thinks he has won. The torches dip, and the night is suddenly torn by the crackle of flame. On the muddy spit of the Ile des Juifs, the fire does not roar initially. It begins as a hungry whisper, feeding on the dry brush and faggots of vine wood that have been stacked with such cruel precision. The air, damp from the river, fills with the thick, acrid scent of wood smoke, a grey curtain that rises to blot out the stars. For the thousands of Parisians lining the banks of the Seine, the spectacle is both mesmerising and terrifying. They are watching the end of an age, the destruction of the last remnants of the Crusades, but as the orange light dances on the water and illuminates the pale faces of the stone gargoyles on Notre Dame, the mood is not one of triumph. It is one of deep, collective unease. This is not the burning of a criminal. It is the burning of a patriarch, a man whose white beard and joined hands make him look, in the flickering light, uncomfortably like a saint in a stained glass window that is melting before their eyes. As the heat intensifies, curling around the feet of the two men bound to the stakes, a hush falls over the city that is heavier than the smoke. The crowd expects screams. They are used to the gruesome soundtrack of executions, the begging and the shrieking that usually accompanies the work of the king's justice, but Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay do not scream. They pray. Reports from the time, preserved by chroniclers who stood near the pyre, tell us that their voices remained steady, chanting the Salve Regina and calling on the Virgin Mary. It is a display of spiritual fortitude that unnerves the soldiers guarding the perimeter. The fire, intended to humiliate them, seems instead to be purifying them, stripping away the years of dungeon filth and the shame of their forced confessions, leaving only the core of the knights they were sworn to be. And then it happens, the moment that will be whispered about in taverns and palaces for 700 years, the moment that transforms a judicial execution into a ghost story. As the flames climb higher, wrapping the Grand Master in a terrible robe of light, Jacques de Molay stops his prayers. He turns his face away from the fire and looks directly toward the royal palace, toward the shadowy figure of the king, who he knows is watching. He looks toward the invisible presence of the Pope in Avignon, and from the heart of the inferno his voice rings out, not with the desperation of a dying man, but with the authority of a judge. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned, he cries, his voice carrying over the crackling wood. Soon a calamity will occur to those who have condemned us to death. The crowd freezes, the soldiers shift uneasily. But Desmoulins is not finished. He takes a breath of the scorching air and issues the summons that will haunt the history of France. Pope Clement, King Philip, Knight Guillaume, de Nogare. I summon you to the tribunal of heaven within the year to receive your just punishment. Cursed, you shall be cursed until the 13th generation of your lines. Historians still argue about the exact wording of this final pronouncement. Some contemporary accounts, like that of the chronicler Geoffroy de Paris, record the defiance and the prediction of divine vengeance, while the specific within a year timeline and the 13th generation detail may have been embroidered by later legends, polished by the terrified hindsight of a populace trying to make sense of what followed. But in the smoky twilight of that March evening, the exact syllables matter less than the feeling that struck the witnesses. It felt like a verdict. It was a dying man bypassing the corrupt courts of earth and appealing directly to the Supreme Court of the sky. It was a reminder that even a king who answers to no one is still a subject in the kingdom of God. The fire surges, and the voice is finally silenced. The bodies of the last Templars slump against the chains, consumed by the element that was meant to erase them. The sparks drift upward, mingling with the smoke, floating over the rooftops of Paris like fireflies, carrying the curse into the wind. When the flames finally die down, leaving only glowing embers and a pile of grey ash on the blackened mud of the island, a strange thing happens. The king's soldiers, who should be clearing the site, are pushed back by the crowd. The people of Paris, who had been told these men were heretics and devil worshippers, rush forward. They do not spit on the remains. They fall to their knees. Men and women scoop up the warm ashes in their hands, wrapping them in handkerchiefs and hems of cloaks, carrying them away as holy relics. In the eyes of the people, the fire has proved the king wrong. The courage of the death has washed away the guilt of the life. The Templars have died as martyrs, and the king has created a cult of the dead that is far more dangerous than the living order ever was. Philip the Fair turns away from his window. The deed is done. The Templar problem is solved. The treasury is his. The threat is gone, and the last voice of opposition has been turned to smoke. He is still the most powerful monarch in Christendom, a man who has bent the Pope and the nobility to his will. He likely tells himself that the shout from the fire was just the raving of a desperate man, words that will vanish as quickly as the smoke. He is a rational man, a man of laws and ledgers, not a man of superstitions. He does not believe in curses, but as he walks through the silent halls of the Louvre that night, the air must feel colder than usual. The king is 46 years old, in the prime of his life, strong and healthy. The Pope in Avignon is sickly but stable. The minister, Guillaume de Nogare, is busy with new schemes. The year is young, but the hourglass has been turned over. The sand has begun to run. And as the citizens of Paris go to their beds, clutching their pouches of ash, they are not sleeping. They are waiting. They are counting the days. The fire on the island has gone out, but a different kind of fire has been lit in the imagination of the kingdom, a slow-burning fuse that is creeping toward the throne. The lullaby of the Templars is over. The tragedy of the cursed kings is about to begin. The smoke from the Ile des Juifs has barely cleared from the Parisian sky, and the ashes of the Grand Master are still fresh in the hidden reliquaries of the faithful when the first tremor of the curse begins to shake the foundations of the world. We must leave the stone capital of the north and travel swiftly south again, back to the sun-drenched lands of Provence, where the air is usually sweet with lavender and thyme. But in the spring of 1314, a strange heaviness hangs over the papal court at Roquemaure, a suffocating atmosphere that feels less like the peace of God and more like the waiting room of a tomb. It has been only 33 days since Jacques de Molay screamed his summons from the fire, 33 days, a number that resonates with dark significance in the Christian mind, echoing the years of Christ's life. And already, the first of the accused is answering the call. Pope Clement V, the man who washed his hands of the Templars to save his own tiara, is dying. His end does not come with the glory of martyrdom or the dignity of old age. It comes with a wretched, grinding agony that mocks his high station. Clement has always been a fragile man, plagued by chronic stomach ailments that he treated with a diet of crushed emeralds and milk, a remedy that likely tore his insides apart faster than any disease. But now, his body seems to be revolting against itself. He lies in a stifling room, the shutters drawn against the blinding southern light, sweating through his silk sheets as waves of nausea and pain rack his frame. To the superstitious minds of his courtiers, whispering in the corridors, this is not merely dysentery or stomach cancer, as modern medicine might diagnose. This is the invisible hand of the Templar Grand Master, reaching out from the grave to squeeze the life from the man who betrayed him. The timing is simply too precise, too terrifyingly poetic to be a coincidence. The Pope who allowed the Knights to burn is now burning from the inside out, as April creeps toward its end. The Pope's suffering becomes a delirium. One can imagine him, in the twilight of his fever, seeing shadows in the corners of the room, perhaps the white mantles of the men he condemned, or the stern face of Philip the Fair, the king, whose friendship cost him his soul. He tries to pray, but the words turn to ash in his mouth. On the night of April 20th, 1314, just as the thunderstorm season begins to rumble over the Rhone Valley, the breathing of the Vicar of Christ hitches and stops. The first summons has been served. Clement V is dead. But the horror of his passing does not end with his last breath. In a twist of fate so macabre that it feels like the work of a grim screenwriter, the curse seems to pursue him, even past the threshold of death. As soon as the Pope's eyes are closed, the chaos that so often follows the death of a medieval potentate erupts. His servants and nephews, the very men he had showered with gold and favours, do not weep or pray. Instead, they loot. In a frenzy of greed, they strip the papal apartments of everything valuable: silver candlesticks, heavy tapestries, even the rings from the dead man's fingers and the clothes from his body. The corpse of the most powerful spiritual leader in the West is left naked and alone on a wooden board, abandoned in the empty, pillaged room like a piece of discarded furniture. And then, the final indignity occurs, a detail so singular that it cemented the legend of the curse in the minds of the people forever. During the night, while the body lay unattended, a wax candle at the head of the bier toppled over. It fell onto the linen shroud that had been hastily thrown over the Pope. The fabric caught fire. The flames licked up the wood of the bed and began to consume the body itself. By the time the servants, perhaps smelling the smoke, rushed back into the room to extinguish the blaze, the lower half of the Pope's body had been severely burned. It was a chilling echo of the Ile des Juifs. Clement V, who had sent the Templars to the fire, had been baptized by fire in his own deathbed. To the medieval mind, obsessed with signs and symbols, this was God's signature on the verdict. The Grand Master had called him to judgment, and the flames had come to collect him. The news of the Pope's death and the grotesque manner of his funeral races north along the rivers and roads, travelling faster than any horse. It reaches Paris, where it lands like a physical blow. The people nod knowingly in the markets, one down. The skeptics who had dismissed de Molay's final words as the ravings of a madman now fall silent, counting the days on their fingers. The within a year prophecy has claimed its first victim with terrifying speed. The atmosphere in the capital shifts from unease to a palpable dread. If the Pope, God's representative on earth, could be struck down so swiftly, what protection is there? For a king, Philip the Fair receives the news in his palace. We can only guess at his reaction. Does he feel a chill of fear? Does he dismiss it as the natural end of a sickly man? Philip is a creature of iron will, not given to panic. He likely attends a mass for the soul of the Pope, his face a mask of statue calm, revealing nothing. He busies himself with the affairs of state, the ongoing friction with Flanders, the management of his sons' households, the hunting trips in the forest of Fontainebleau. He is determined to show that the business of France continues, that the death of a pope is just a political inconvenience, not a supernatural event. But the shadow has lengthened. The king is now alone on the stage. The partner of his crime is gone. The eyes of the kingdom are fixed on him, watching for a stumble, a cough, a sign of weakness. Historians still argue whether the stress of the curse contributed to what happened next, or if it was simply the inevitable decline of a man who had carried the weight of a kingdom for 30 years. But the psychological pressure must have been immense. Every headache, every stumble of his horse, every shadow in the hallway would now be interpreted through the lens of the curse. The king is living in a glass house of his own making, and the storm clouds are gathering. As the summer of 1314 burns itself out, and the leaves in the royal forests begin to turn the colour of blood and gold, Philip seems healthy, strong, and untouchable. But the year is not over. The calendar of the curse still has months to run. And deep in the woods, where the king loves to hunt the wild boar, something is waiting for him. Something as relentless and unyielding as he is. The second summons is being prepared, and unlike the Pope's, it will come not in a bed, but in the saddle, amidst the ancient silent trees that care nothing for the divine right of kings. The year of the curse turns toward its close, and the golden light of autumn gives way to the grey, skeletal branches of November. In the forests around Paris, the leaves have fallen, creating a damp copper carpet that muffles the hooves of horses, and the air carries the biting promise of the coming winter. King Philip the Fair, the man who has outlived the Pope by 7 months, is still standing. He has survived the spring and the summer. He has seen the harvest brought in, and he likely believes that he has outrun the ghost. He is 46 years old, not young by medieval standards, but certainly not old, still possessing the upright carriage and the terrifying frozen beauty that earned him his name. To the observers at court, he appears as immutable as the stone walls of the Louvre, a monarch who has bent the world to his shape and who shows no sign of breaking. But the calendar is a relentless thing, and the year spoken in the flames has not yet run its course. On the 4th of November 1314, seeking respite from the endless drudgery of council meetings and the heavy atmosphere of a capital that still whispers about burning knights, Philip orders a royal hunt. He travels to the forest of Halat, near Pont Saint-Maxence, a favourite hunting ground where the trees are ancient and the game is plentiful. The hunt is the sport of kings, a formalised ritual of violence that mimics war, and Philip, usually so controlled and dispassionate, seems to find a strange solace in the chase. We can imagine the scene, the baying of the hounds echoing through the mist, the sharp notes of the horns, the king riding at the head of his retinue, his velvet cap pulled low against the chill. For a few hours, he is just a man on a horse, chasing a stag or a boar through the undergrowth, the worries of the treasury and the church left behind in the city. But deep in the woods, something is waiting. The historical record here blurs into the fog of legend, creating one of those scholarly debates that make history so fascinating. The chroniclers are divided on what exactly happened in the shadow of the trees. Some say that a wild boar, a beast of monstrous size, suddenly charged from a thicket, startling the king's horse and causing it to rear violently, throwing the monarch to the hard, frozen ground. Others, leaning toward a medical explanation, suggest that the king simply suffered a cerebral accident, a massive stroke, or a brain hemorrhage, while in the saddle, collapsing not from an external blow, but from a sudden, catastrophic failure within. Perhaps the truth is a blend of both. A sudden dizziness, a moment of weakness in a man who never showed weakness, a slip of the reins, and then the fall. What is certain is that the King of France, the ruler of the West, is found lying on the forest floor, unable to speak, his beautiful face twisted, his eyes open, but seeing something far beyond the canopy of oak branches. The statue has finally cracked. His attendants, panicked and horrified, rush to his side. They lift his paralyzed body onto a litter, a humiliating transformation for a man who lived his life looking down on others, and carry him not back to Paris, which is too far, but to the chateau of Fontainebleau, his birthplace. There is a poetic symmetry to this. The king has come full circle, returning to the room where he began to end his journey. For weeks he lingers in a twilight state, hovering between life and death. The news spreads slowly, travelling in hushed whispers. The king has fallen. The boar got him. The curse. In the minds of the peasantry, the wild boar is not just an animal. It is a symbol of the devil, or perhaps a manifestation of the Templars' anger, a beast of the earth sent to humble the man who thought he could rewrite the laws of heaven. As Philip lies in his bed at Fontainebleau, staring at the tapestries with eyes that can no longer command, he is said to have had moments of lucid clarity. He asks for his confessor. He realizes, with the terrible precision of a mathematician, that the date is approaching. It is late November. The year is not up. The summons is valid. One can only wonder what thoughts passed through the mind of this enigma of a man as the days slipped away. Did he regret the fire? Did he regret the taxes, the wars, the expulsion of the Jews, the arrest of the Templars? Or did he die as he lived, convinced that he was the instrument of a higher necessity, a king who did what had to be done for France? Tradition says that in his final hours Philip was racked with remorse, not for the Templars specifically, but for the heavy taxes he had laid upon his people. He ordered that the crusade tax he had collected be refunded, a final, desperate attempt to balance the spiritual ledger before the audit. But it was too little, too late. On the 29th of November, 1314, just weeks before the anniversary of the Templar execution would have expired, Philip the Fair stopped breathing. The second summons had been answered. The shock that runs through Europe is profound. In less than a year, the two architects of the Templar destruction, the Pope and the King, are dead. To the medieval mind, this is not coincidence. This is cause and effect. The curse of Jacques de Molay has been validated by the highest authority imaginable. The story of the cursed kings is no longer a rumour. It is a fact of history. The people look at the royal family with new eyes, searching for the next sign of the contagion, and they do not have to look far. Philip leaves behind 3 adult sons, Louis, Philip and Charles, and a beautiful daughter, Isabella, who is Queen of England. On paper, the dynasty looks secure. The succession is guaranteed 3 times over. The Capetian miracle, the genetic good luck that has given France an unbroken line of male heirs for 3 centuries, seems intact, but beneath the surface, the rot has already set in. The immense centralised machine of government that Philip built requires a genius to run it, and his sons are not geniuses. They are quarrelsome, scandalous, and weak. The iron grip of the father is gone, and the wolves, the disgruntled nobles, the overtaxed merchants, the ambitious uncles, are beginning to circle the throne. As the body of Philip the Fair is prepared for burial, to be interred in the Basilica of Saint-Denis among his ancestors, the mood in the court is not just one of mourning, but of deep apprehension. The shield of the kingdom has been shattered. The Iron King is dead, and his inheritance is a kingdom filled with debt, resentment, and a supernatural shadow that seems to be lengthening over his children. The camera pulls back from the deathbed at Fontainebleau, leaving the silent king to the history books, and moves toward the younger generation, the cursed kings who must now step into the light. But before they can even grasp the scepter, a scandal is breaking in the heart of their own households, a secret that has been festering behind the closed doors of the Tower of Nesle, involving lust, betrayal, and the three women who are meant to be the future queens of France. The curse, it seems, is not done with the men. It is coming for their wives. To understand the poisoned chalice that the sons of Philip the Fair are about to drink, we must pause the forward march of time and slip back just a few months, stepping out of the funeral gloom of 1314 and into the deceptive brightness of the preceding spring. We find ourselves standing on the left bank of the Seine, looking up at a formidable stone cylinder that rises from the water like a dark finger pointing at the moon, the Tower of Nesle. It is a place of shadows and damp echoes, a small fortress standing opposite the Louvre, guarding the river approach to Paris. But in the whispered folklore of the city, this tower is not a military post. It is a cage of secrets. While the king was busy destroying the Templars, a rot was eating away at the very heart of his own family, a domestic tragedy that would do more damage to the French monarchy than any curse ever could. This is the story of the Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal of such explosive intimacy that it shattered the legitimacy of the royal line and set the stage for 100 years of war. The players in this drama are the three daughters-in-law of the king, the wives of his three sons. They are Marguerite of Burgundy, the wife of Louis, and her cousins, the sisters Blanche and Jeanne of Burgundy, wives of Charles and Philip. They are young, beautiful, and dangerously bored, married for political alliance to men who are described by chroniclers as strange, weak, or dull. These high-spirited women find life in the stifling, pious court of the Iron King to be a suffocating trap. Marguerite and Blanche, in particular, chafe against the rules. They crave laughter, warmth, and the kind of admiration that their husbands, one surly, one rigid, one sickly, cannot or will not provide. And so, under the cover of night, the story goes that they slip away from the royal apartments. They cross the river. They meet in the privacy of the Tower of Nesle. Waiting for them in the shadows are two brothers, knights of the royal household, Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay. They are handsome, dashing, and recklessly stupid. They are not great lords, they are minor nobles who have been dazzled by the attention of princesses. What begins perhaps as a flirtation, a dangerous game of glances across the banquet hall, spirals into a full-blown affair. For months, perhaps years, the deception continues. It is a treason of the heart, hidden behind heavy curtains and the stone walls of the tower. Jeanne, the eldest and most prudent of the three sisters, does not take a lover herself, but she knows. She acts as the go-between, the keeper of the secret, perhaps getting a vicarious thrill from the danger her cousins are courting. In the eyes of the law, she is an accomplice. In the eyes of history, she is the witness who stood by while the fuse was lit. The discovery of the affair is a masterpiece of detective work, attributed to the sharp eyes of Isabella, the Queen of England, and daughter of Philip the Fair. Known as the She-Wolf of France, Isabella visits her father's court in early 1314. She brings gifts, beautifully embroidered silk purses or aumônières, which she presents to her sisters-in-law. Days later, at a great feast, Isabella notices something that makes her blood run cold. The purses she gave to the princesses are hanging from the belts of two knights, the Darnay brothers. It is a fatal error, a gesture of vanity from lovers who thought they were untouchable. The purses were intimate tokens, not meant to be re-gifted to guardsmen. Isabella says nothing in the moment, but she goes to her father. She whispers the impossible truth. The future queens of France are adulteresses. Historians still argue about the exact details. Was it truly the purses, or was that a later embellishment to a story of simple political surveillance? Regardless of the trigger, the king's reaction is swift and terrifying. He places the brothers under surveillance. He waits, he watches, and then, when the trap is full, he strikes. The knights are arrested. The princesses are seized at the Abbey of Maubuisson. The interrogation is brutal. The Darnay brothers, faced with the king's torturers, break quickly. They confess to sleeping with the wives of the king's sons. The punishment that follows is one of the grim landmarks of medieval justice. The crime is not just adultery, it is lèse-majesté. By touching the wives of the heirs, the Darnay brothers have corrupted the royal bloodline. If Marguerite or Blanche were to become pregnant, a bastard could sit on the throne of France. The treason is biological. On April 19th, 1314, months before the king's own death, the Darnay brothers are executed in the public square of Pontoise. The details are too gruesome to dwell on in a lullaby, but let us simply say they suffer every indignity a body can endure, their screams serving as a horrifying warning to any man who dares to look at a queen. They are finally beheaded, and their bodies are hung on the gibbet, left to rot in the wind. But for the women, the tragedy is a slower, colder thing. They are not executed. Royal blood is too precious to spill, but they are erased. Marguerite and Blanche are stripped of their finery. Their heads are shaved, a humiliating stripping of their femininity and status, and they are dressed in rough wool. They are driven in black-draped wagons to the Chateau Gaillard, a grim, wind-swept fortress on a high cliff overlooking the Seine in Normandy. There they are thrown into underground cells, damp, dark pits exposed to the elements. Jeanne, who was only an accomplice, gets off lighter. She is confined to a castle in Dourdan, and her husband, Philip the Tall, who actually loves her, eventually works to clear her name. But for Marguerite and Blanche, the doors of the world are slammed shut. This is the scandal that is poisoning the air when Philip the Fair dies in November. His sons, Louis and Charles, are humiliated men, cuckolds in the eyes of the entire kingdom. Louis, now King Louis XIII, is a man consumed by rage and shame. He is married to a woman who is locked in a dungeon, a woman he cannot divorce because the Pope is dead and there is no one to grant an annulment. He is a king without a queen, a husband without a wife, and a father who looks at his own daughter, little Joan, and wonders if she is truly his. The legitimacy of the Capetian line, which had been as solid as a diamond for 3 centuries, has suddenly developed a fatal crack. The people of Paris, whispering in the taverns, connect the dots. The Grand Master burned in March. The scandal broke in April. The king died in November. The curse is working. It is dismantling the family from the inside out, turning love into poison and desire into treason. As we linger for a moment in the cold cell of Chateau Gaillard, listening to the wind howl around the stone walls, we can imagine Marguerite of Burgundy huddled in the dark. She is a queen of France, yet she sleeps on straw. She was the toast of the court, and now she is a ghost. She knows that her husband is now king, which makes her technically the queen, but she also knows that Louis wants her dead. The tragedy of the Tower of Nesle is not just about sex. It is about the fragility of power, how a dynasty that survived wars and crusades can be brought to its knees by a secret whispered in the dark. The Iron King left his son a crown, but he also left him a broken marriage and a doubt that will eat the kingdom alive. Louis the Soint stands before the coronation altar, but he is looking over his shoulder, haunted by the laughter of the Daunay brothers and the silence of his imprisoned wife. The Iron King is dead, buried in the cold crypts of Saint-Denis, and the crown of France has passed to a head that is far less steady. We now turn our gaze to Louis VI, the eldest son of Philip, a man who steps into the light of history with a nickname that sounds less like a royal title and more like a warning label, Louis le Hutin, or the Quarreller. Some translate it as the headstrong or the stubborn, but the Quarreller captures the essence of a man who seems perpetually at war with his own limitations. Louis is 25 years old, but he possesses the emotional maturity of a teenager who has just been handed the keys to a very expensive car he doesn't know how to drive. He is short, physically strong, and fond of tennis, a game he plays with a violent intensity that will eventually be his undoing. But he lacks the terrifying statuesque silence of his father. Where Philip stared, Louis shouts. Where Philip calculated, Louis swings. He has inherited the most powerful kingdom in Christendom, but he finds it is made of sand, debt, and whispers. The winter of 1315 is one of the darkest in memory. The weather seems to mourn the old king. The rains are relentless, turning the roads of France into rivers of sucking mud, rotting the seed in the ground and promising famine in the spring. It is a fitting backdrop for Louis's reign, which begins in a storm of crises. The treasury, which Philip had ruthlessly filled with Templar gold, is mysteriously empty. The money has vanished into the bottomless pits of the Flemish wars and the pockets of corrupt ministers. To make matters worse, the nobility of France, kept under the iron boot of Philip for 30 years, sees the new king's weakness and rises up. Like wolves sensing a limping stag, they form leagues, demanding the return of their old feudal privileges, the right to mint their own money, and the right to wage private wars. Louis finds himself besieged not by foreign enemies, but by his own dukes and counts, who wave parchments in his face and shout demands in his council chamber. He spends his days arguing, signing concessions he doesn't understand, and shouting orders that no one obeys. It is a humiliating start, a realization that the absolute monarchy was a magic trick performed by his father, a trick Louis does not know how to repeat. But the greatest shadow hanging over the quarreller is not the debt or the rebels. It is the empty space beside him on the throne. Louis is a king without a queen. His wife, Marguerite of Burgundy, is still alive, shivering in the dungeon of Chateau Gaillard, but she is dead to the court. Louis is desperate to remarry. He needs a male heir to secure the dynasty. As his only child with Marguerite is a girl, Joan, whose legitimacy is clouded by the Tower of Nesle scandal. Louis has already chosen his new bride, the beautiful, pious, and exotic Clemence of Hungary. He dreams of her, of a fresh start, of a son who will wash away the shame of the Daunay affair. But there is a snag, a bureaucratic knot, tied tight by the curse of the Templars. To marry Clemence, he needs an annulment. To get an annulment, he needs a pope. And there is no pope. The death of Clement V, the first victim of the curse, has left the church in a state of chaotic paralysis. The cardinals, terrified by the violence in Italy and the pressure from France, have scattered. They are locked in a bitter conclave that has dragged on for months, fighting over who should wear the tiara. They meet in the town of Carpentras, but instead of praying for the Holy Spirit, they bicker, plot, and eventually flee when a mob attacks the conclave, setting fire to the building and shouting, "Death to the Italians!" It is a dark farce. The church is headless. The keys to heaven are lost in the luggage of fleeing prelates, and Louis VI is trapped. He cannot legally divorce his imprisoned wife without the signature of a pontiff who does not exist. The frustration of the king grows manic. He sends messengers to the cardinals, threatening them, begging them, ordering them to elect someone, anyone, so he can get his divorce. But the cardinals are too busy saving their own skins. The curse of Jacques de Molay seems to be working through the machinery of the institution itself, jamming the gears so thoroughly that the most powerful man in France is held hostage by a vacancy. Louis paces the floors of the Louvre, looking at the portrait of Clémence, and then looking north toward the grey cliffs of Normandy, where Marguerite still breathes. He realizes that if the church cannot untie the knot, he may have to cut it. Historians still argue about the level of Louis's direct involvement in what followed, but the timeline is damning. He begins to treat Marguerite not as a wife to be punished, but as an obstacle to be removed. He orders that her imprisonment be made harsher. The slow camera of our story zooms in on the cold circular room at Chateau Gaillard. The tapestries are gone. The fire is rarely lit. The food is meagre. Marguerite, once the lively, laughing centre of the court, is wasting away. She is only in her 20s, but she looks like an old woman, her beauty scoured away by grief and the damp chill of the stone. She writes letters to her husband begging for mercy, promising to enter a convent if he will only release her. The letters are never answered. Louis does not want a nun. He wants a widower's freedom. As the spring of 1315 struggles to break through the mud, the king makes a frantic attempt to raise money. He recalls the Jews, whom his father had expelled, inviting them back into the kingdom, not out of tolerance, but because he can tax them for the privilege of returning. He sells freedom to the serfs, declaring that, according to the law of nature, everyone should be born free, a beautiful sentiment that is immediately undercut by the fact that he forces them to pay for this freedom, essentially selling them their own bodies to fund his coronation. It is the act of a desperate man scraping the bottom of the barrel. But all the gold in France cannot buy him a new wife as long as the old one lives. The tension in the court becomes suffocating. Everyone knows the king is waiting for news from Normandy. The courtiers whisper that the damp air of the prison is unhealthy, a euphemism for a death sentence that nature is taking too long to execute. Louis is preparing for his coronation at Reims, set for August, but he refuses to be crowned alone. He wants Clemence by his side. The clock is ticking. The quarreller is done arguing with fate. If the curse killed his father and the Pope, perhaps he can use death to his own advantage. In the final days of April 1315, a rider leaves the palace with sealed orders for the governor of Chateau Gaillard. The king goes to his tennis court, picking up his racket, hitting the ball against the wall with a rhythmic, violent thud, 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 like the heartbeat of a man who is afraid to stop moving. He is trying to outrun the shadow, but he is merely running deeper into it. The inheritance of the Iron King has turned out to be a trap, and Louis is chewing off his own limb to escape it. Far to the north, in the tower that overlooks the winding Seine, Marguerite of Burgundy looks out at the river one last time. She does not know that her husband has just decided to become a widower by any means necessary. The curse is about to claim its first female victim, not by fire, but by the cold, quiet hand of a closed door. We move now from the frantic tennis courts of Paris to the high, wind-blasted cliffs of Normandy, where the Seine twists like a grey snake through the chalk hills. Perched here is the Chateau Gaillard, the saucy castle built by Richard the Lionheart a century earlier, a masterpiece of concentric fortifications designed to be impregnable. But in the spring of 1315, this fortress is not defending the realm, it is hiding its shame. Deep within the rock, in an open-air cell exposed to the biting winds that sweep up from the river valley, Marguerite of Burgundy is living her final days. The slow camera of our story descends into this pit, where the stone walls are slick with niter, and the only sound is the howling of the gale and the chattering of teeth. It is hard to reconcile the shivering, emaciated figure huddled in the corner with the vibrant princess who once ruled the nightly revels at the Tower of Nazle. Her head, once adorned with pearls and silk veils, is shorn to the scalp, a brutal stripping of her identity that marks her as a penitent and a prisoner. Her velvet gowns have been replaced by a rough woolen shift that offers little protection against the damp that seeps into her bones. She is 25 years old, but she looks 60, a hollowed-out vessel of regret and terror. The tragedy of Marguerite is that she is the victim of a political equation that no longer balances. As long as she breathes, Louis the Fix cannot remarry, and France cannot have a male heir. She has become a living blockade in the path of the dynasty. Historians still argue about the precise nature of her end. Did she succumb to pneumonia brought on by the harsh conditions, a natural death accelerated by royal neglect? Or was the hand of the king more direct? There are dark whispers in the chronicles of the time suggesting that a loyal servant of Louis, perhaps a man named Robert d'Artois, arrived at the castle with silent orders. Some legends say she was strangled with her own hair, though she had none left. Others, that she was smothered with a towel, or simply that the shutters of her cell were deliberately left open during a freezing night, allowing the cold to do the work of a hangman. The most likely truth is a grim mixture. She was placed in a situation where survival was impossible, and when she did not die fast enough, the end was hastened. On the morning of April 30th, 1315, the cell is silent. The guards find the Queen of France curled on the stone floor, cold to the touch. There is no state funeral, no lying in state at Saint-Denis. She is buried quickly, quietly, in the church of the Cordeliers in Vernon, a humble grave for a woman who wore the crown. The news travels to Paris with the speed of a bird released from a cage. When the messenger kneels before Louis the Fix to whisper that he is a widower, the king does not weep. He does not order a period of mourning. Instead, he breathes a sigh of relief so profound it almost blows the candles out. The blockade is gone. The path to the future is clear. With indecent haste, Louis moves to secure his new bride. He has been exchanging love letters with Clemence of Hungary, a princess famous for her beauty and her almost saintly piety, the polar opposite of the sensual, reckless Marguerite. Clemence is currently in Naples, and Louis, in his impatience, commands her to come to France immediately. He meets her on the road, unwilling even to wait for her arrival in Paris. They are married in August, just 3 months after Marguerite's body was lowered into the ground. The wedding at the chateau of Fontainebleau is meant to be a fairy tale, a restoration of joy and light to a court that has been shrouded in gloom for a year. Louis looks at his new wife with genuine adoration. She is his second chance, his redemption, the mother of the son who will save the house of Capet. But the curse, it seems, has a sense of irony. The coronation of Louis and Clemence is scheduled for late August in the city of Reims, the sacred site where all French kings are anointed. It should be a day of golden sun and splendour. Instead, the heavens open. The summer of 1315 is historically known as the beginning of the Great Famine, triggered by relentless biblical rains that rot the crops in the fields. On the day of the coronation, the rain falls in sheets, turning the roads to rams into sucking quagmires. The royal procession, usually a glittering river of steel and silk, becomes a muddy trudge. The king's horse stumbles in the slime. The courtiers are soaked to the skin, their finery ruined. Inside the cathedral, the damp is so pervasive that the walls run with water. As Louis feels the weight of the crown settle on his head, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof drowns out the choir. The people, shivering in the flooded streets, do not cheer with their usual enthusiasm. They look at the grey sky and whisper that God is weeping for the murdered queen. They call Louis le roi hautain, the quarreller, but now they also call him the muddy king, despite the omens. For a brief few months, it seems that Louis might outrun his fate. Clémence becomes pregnant. The court holds its breath. This is the miracle they have been praying for. If the child is a boy, the succession is secure, the Darnay scandal is rendered irrelevant, and the curse is broken. Louis is ecstatic. He dotes on Clémence, terrified of losing her, surrounding her with doctors and relics. He is desperate to be a father, to be a true king, to prove that he is more than just the disappointing son of the Iron King. He throws himself into the business of ruling with a frantic energy, trying to raise money for a new campaign in Flanders to wash away the humiliation of his muddy coronation. He wants a military victory to lay at the feet of his newborn son. But the quarreller cannot stop quarrelling, even with his own body. In June 1316, the king is at the palace of Vincennes. It is a hot day, a rare break in the endless rain. Louis has been playing tennis, jeu de paume, for hours. He plays with a manic intensity, sweating profusely, his face red, swinging the racket as if he is fighting an invisible enemy. Exhausted and overheating, he staggers off the court and demands wine. Not warm, spiced wine, but cool, fresh wine from the cellar. He drinks it in great greedy gulps. Within hours, the king is screaming. His stomach, perhaps already weakened by dysentery contracted in the muddy army camps, revolts. A violent fever seizes him. He takes to his bed, shivering uncontrollably, just as his first wife had shivered in her cell. The doctors crowd around, bleeding him, offering purgatives, but the statue king's son is made of brittle clay. He drifts into delirium. He calls out for Clémence, who is heavy with his child. He calls out for his father. On June 5th, 1316, less than 2 years after taking the throne, Louis the Mech dies. He is 26 years old. The shock is absolute. The curse has claimed the third victim. The Pope, the Iron King, and now the quarreller. But the situation Louis leaves behind is a nightmare of legal complexity. The throne is empty, but not quite. The Queen is pregnant. If the child in her womb is a boy, he is the King of France from the moment of his birth. If it is a girl, the succession is thrown into chaos. For the first time in 300 years, France has no king. It has only a question mark waiting in a woman's belly. The court freezes. The vultures, Louis's brothers, Philip and Charles, and his ambitious uncle, Charles of Valois, gather around the grieving, terrified widow. They must wait. For 5 long months, the entire kingdom is held in suspense, governed by a regent, waiting for a baby to cry. The curse has paused the clock, leaving France hanging by a thread of hope, a thread that leads to a nursery where a cradle is being prepared for a child who will face the weight of history before he can even open his eyes. The summer of 1316 fades into a restless autumn, and the kingdom of France holds its breath, suspended in a state of terrifying limbo. For 5 long months, the throne is technically empty, a velvet chair gathering dust in the halls of the Louvre, while the true centre of power has shifted to a heavily guarded bedchamber in the castle of Vincennes. Here, Queen Clémence, the grieving widow of the quarreller, waits for the birth of the child who will decide the fate of the nation. It is a time of unbearable tension. The regent of the kingdom is Philip, the younger brother of the dead king, a man known as Philip the Tall, Philippe le Long. He is everything his brother Louis was not: intelligent, slender, ascetic, and terrifyingly efficient. He governs with a cold, mathematical precision, keeping the unruly barons in check and the treasury from collapsing. But his eyes are constantly fixed on the Queen's swelling belly. The court watches him, whispering the question that hangs in the air, like smoke. Does the regent want a nephew to serve or a crown to wear? If the child is a boy, Philip remains a servant. If it is a girl, the path to the throne becomes a maze of legal questions that Philip is uniquely equipped to navigate. The air in the palace is thick with suspicion, food tasters are everywhere, and the Queen is surrounded by a fortress of midwives and guards, protecting the fragile hope of the dynasty from the shadows of ambition. On the night of November 13th, 1316, the labour pains begin. The castle wakes up. Messengers run through the corridors. The great lords of France, including the Regent Philip and the King's uncle, Charles of Valois, gather in the antechamber, waiting for the cry that will announce the future. The labour is difficult, a physical ordeal for the grief-stricken Clémence, but as the dawn of November 15th breaks, a child is born. The midwife brings the bundle out to the waiting men. It is a boy. A wave of relief washes over the kingdom that is almost physical. The Capetian miracle is held. The dynasty is safe. The bells of Paris begin to ring, pealing out a joyous, frantic rhythm that rolls across the city. The child is named Jean, and he is King of France. From the very moment he draws his first breath, he is John the Feuant, known to history by the haunting epithet Jean le Posthume, John the Posthumous. He is a tiny, fragile sovereign, wrapped in swaddling clothes embroidered with golden lilies, held in the arms of nurses who tremble with the weight of their responsibility. For a few shining days, it seems that the curse has been broken by the sheer innocence of new life. The barons swear fealty to the cradle. Philip the Tall kneels before his nephew, his face a mask of loyal devotion, though one wonders what thoughts are moving behind those cool, grey eyes. But the curse of the Templars is not done. It has merely changed its target from the guilty to the innocent. The joy lasts exactly 5 days. On November 19th, the infant king falls ill. It happens with terrifying speed. One moment he is nursing a healthy, vigorous baby. The next, he is convulsing, his skin turning a dark, bruised colour, his breathing ragged and shallow. The panic in the nursery is absolute. The doctors are summoned, but their remedies, crushed pearls, prayers, bleeding, are useless against the shadow that has entered the room. Clémence is hysterical, clutching her son, screaming that he has been murdered, and, in the dark corners of the court, the whispers begin immediately. They say the baby was poisoned. They say a pin, dipped in venom, was slipped into his skull through the fontanelle. They say his wet nurse was bribed to rub poison on her breast, and the finger of suspicion points, inevitably, to one man, Philip the Tall. He is the one who benefits. He is the one who was next in line. Did the uncle kill the nephew to seize the crown? Historians still argue, with a passion that defies the centuries, about the death of John the Feuant. Modern medical experts suggest that infant mortality in the Middle Ages was appallingly high, even for princes, and that the baby likely died of natural causes, perhaps sepsis, a heart defect, or a sudden infection. The blackening of the body, often cited as proof of poison, is a common post-mortem effect in infants. Yet, the timing is so impeccable, so convenient for Philip, that the stain of murder has never quite washed away. There is also a persistent romantic legend that refuses to die, the story of the switched baby This theory claims that the real King John was secretly swapped with a peasant child to protect him from his uncle, and that the baby who died was a decoy. The true king, so the story goes, was spirited away to Italy, where he grew up as a merchant named Giannino Baglioni, eventually discovering his identity and dying in a failed attempt to reclaim his throne. It is a tale worthy of a novel, a ghost story that adds a layer of mystery to the tragedy, but the grim reality is likely far simpler and sadder. A baby died, and a dynasty died with him. As the life fades from the tiny body of John the Fascer, the silence in the room is heavy and final. The king is dead. Long live who? For the first time in history, the House of Capet has no direct male heir. The line that ran from father to son for 300 years has snapped. The throne is truly empty now, and the predators are no longer circling. They are landing. Clemence of Hungary collapses into a grief that will lead her to a life of pious seclusion, forever haunted by the memory of her 5-day son. She will eventually fade from the story, a tragic footnote in the history of the cursed kings. But for Philip the Tall, the death of the nephew is the starting gun. He does not have time to mourn. He knows that his niece, Joan, the daughter of Louis the Saxe and the imprisoned Marguerite, is still alive. By the laws of feudal proximity, she has a strong claim to the throne. But Joan is a girl, and worse, she is a girl whose legitimacy is tainted by the Tower of Nesle affair. Philip moves with the speed of a striking cobra. He orders the gates of Paris closed. He summons his soldiers. He seizes the treasury. He declares himself king, not regent. But he knows that force alone is not enough. He needs a law to justify his usurpation. He needs to invent a rule that says a woman cannot wear the crown of France. As the funeral procession for the infant king winds its way to Saint-Denis, a tiny coffin carried through the weeping crowds, the atmosphere is not just one of sorrow, but of deep, systemic anxiety. The curse has struck at the root. It has taken the future. And now, men are gathering in dusty libraries and chapter houses, pulling down ancient scrolls, looking for a legal weapon to use against a little girl. The tragedy of the 5-day king is not just the death of a child. It is the death of clarity. The clarity of succession is gone, replaced by the murky waters of political expediency. Philip the Tall is about to commit a second crime, not of murder, but of theft. He is about to steal the birthright of women to save the ambition of men. The slow camera lingers on the small tomb in the basilica, where the boy who was king for a week sleeps, oblivious to the fact that his death has just unlocked the door to the 100 Years' War. The Iron King's line is failing, and the brothers are fighting over the scraps. The funeral incense has barely cleared from the aisles of Saint-Denis when the machinery of state begins to turn with a grinding metallic urgency. Philip the Tall, the man who stood by the cradle of the 5-day king, does not wait for the tears of the court to dry. He knows that power is a fluid thing, and if he does not cup it in his hands now, it will slip away into the chaos of a civil war. We find ourselves in the early days of 1317 in a Paris that is gripped by a cold grey uncertainty. The throne is technically claimed, for Philip had himself crowned at Rheims in a ceremony that felt less like a celebration and more like a heist. The gates of the city were locked, the soldiers were on high alert, and the peers of the realm were notably absent, staying away in protest at this uncle who stepped over a dead baby and a living niece to seize the sceptre. Philip the Fascif is now the king, but he is a king sitting on a chair with 3 legs. He is intelligent, perhaps the most brilliant of all Philip the Fair's sons, a man with a mind like a neatly arranged ledger, but he knows that intelligence is not enough. He needs legitimacy. He needs to prove to the world that his theft is actually the law. and so he summons the slow camera of our story into the great hall of the Palace of the Cité in February 1317. The room is packed with the nervous energy of a courtroom drama. Gathered here are the prelates, the barons, and the doctors of the University of Paris, the intellectual elite of the kingdom. They have been brought together to answer a single burning question: can a woman inherit the crown of France? It is a question that has never really been asked before, because for 300 years the Capetian dynasty always had a son. Luck had been their law. But now that luck has run out, and they must look for a rule. Philip watches them from the dais, his long, slender fingers tapping on the armrest. He knows what answer he needs. He needs them to say no, because if the answer is yes, then his niece Joan, the daughter of the quarreller, is the rightful queen, and Philip is a usurper who deserves the axe. What follows is one of the most significant and cynical feats of legal engineering in history. Philip's lawyers, dusty men with ink-stained fingers, dig deep into the archives. They bypass the laws of feudal custom, which generally allowed women to inherit land and titles. After all, grand duchies, like Aquitaine, had been ruled by women. They ignore the fact that England has had queens. Instead, they pull a rabbit out of a very old, very moth-eaten hat. They rediscover, or perhaps reinterpret, an ancient tribal code of the Salian Franks, a document dating back nearly 1,000 years to the dark forests of the barbarian age. It is called the Lex Salica, the Salic law. Originally, this code had nothing to do with kings. It was a rule about private property, stating that Salic land could not pass to a woman. It was meant to keep family farms intact, but Philip's jurists with a straight face argue that the Kingdom of France is the ultimate Salic land. They spin a narrative that the dignity of the French crown is too high, too sacred to be held by a female hand or transferred to a foreign husband. The lilies do not spin, they quote from the Bible, twisting a verse about flowers into a constitutional ban on queens. The assembly, cowed by the king's presence and perhaps relieved to avoid a regency for a little girl whose mother was a convicted adulteress, agrees. They nod their heads, they sign the parchments, and with the scratch of a quill the door is slammed shut. A new fundamental law is born. In France, no woman can succeed to the throne. Poor Joan is disinherited, stripped of her birthright by a room full of men who are terrified of a female sovereign. She is given a consolation prize, the Kingdom of Navarre, but the crown of St. Louis is placed firmly beyond her reach. Philip V breathes easier. He has retroactively legalized his coup. He is now the rightful king, protected by the wisdom of the ancients. But the tragedy of Philip the Tall is that he is a man fighting a war against irony. He is a capable ruler, a man who desperately wants to restore the order and prosperity of his father's reign. He reorganizes the treasury, he tries to standardize weights and measures, he works 18 hours a day to govern the kingdom. He is a technocrat before the word existed, a man who believes that the state can be fixed with enough decrees. Yet the curse of the Templars seems to have a specific, cruel sense of humour for him. Philip, the man who codified the law that women cannot inherit, has a wife who gives him children. But what kind of children? Daughters, one after another. He has 4 surviving daughters, Joan, Margaret, Isabel, and Blanche. He loves them, dotes on them, but every time a girl is born, the court whispers. The king has built a wall to keep women out, and now he is trapped behind it, with only women for heirs. He is writing his own dynasty's obituary with every line of the Salic law. There is a brief flicker of hope in 1316, when a son named Philip is born. The bells ring again. The king prays. But the boy dies within a year. The curse, it seems, has become a hunter of male children. Philip works harder, his face growing more gaunt, his temper shorter. He feels the time slipping away. He is trying to build a fortress of administration that will survive him, but he knows that without a son, it is all for nothing. If he dies without a male heir, the crown will pass not to his capable daughters, but to his younger brother, Charles, a man whom everyone, including Philip, considers a fool. The atmosphere of Philip VI's reign is one of twilight competency. It is a time of order, yes, but it is a brittle order, maintained by a man who knows he is walking on thin ice. The court is quieter, more sombre. The wild parties of the Tower of Nesle era are gone. The king is pious, almost grimly so. He surrounds himself with clerks and lawyers, the new men who help him run the state. But outside the palace walls, the country is not quiet. The weather continues to be terrible. The famine drags on. The people are hungry. And when people are hungry, they start to see monsters. Rumours begin to drift in from the countryside. Strange, terrifying stories about poisoned wells and conspiracies of the outcast. The order that Philip tries to impose from Paris is fraying at the edges, unravelling in the muddy villages where the king's writ feels very far away. As we leave the great hall, where the Salic law has just been enshrined in history, a decision that will eventually trigger the 100 Years' War when the English king claims the throne through his mother, we see Philip V standing by the window, looking out at the rain. He has won the legal battle, he has defeated his niece, he is the king, but he is a king without a son, a builder whose house is built on a foundation of theft. He has closed the door to women, but in doing so, he has locked himself in a room with his own doom. And far away, in the deep provinces of France, a new horror is stirring, a wave of mass hysteria that will test the tall king's rationality to its breaking point. The lepers are gathering, or so the rumours say, and they are bringing a poison that no law can stop. We turn our eyes now from the cold stone floors of the Parisian court to the open, muddy roads of the French countryside, where the wind blows unchecked across fields that have seen too much rain and too little sun. The year is 1320, and while Philip the Tall sits in his palace surrounded by clerks and ledgers, frantically trying to impose order on the kingdom through the power of the written word, a different kind of power is rising in the provinces, a dark, chaotic energy born of hunger, superstition, and a terrified belief that the world is ending. The curse of the Templars, which first struck at the heads of kings and popes, has now seeped down into the soil itself, poisoning the minds of the common people. After years of famine, where the crops rotted in the ground and children went to sleep with bellies full of grass, the peasantry is in a state of collective trauma. They are looking for a saviour or a scapegoat, and in the fevered summer of 1320, they find both in a movement that history calls the Crusade of the Shepherds, or the Pastoureaux. It begins as a murmur in Normandy, a strange, ecstatic rumour that spreads among teenage shepherds and swineherds. They claim that they have received visions from the Virgin Mary, telling them that the Holy Land will not be reconquered by knights in armour who have failed, sinful and proud, but by the poor and the humble. They gather in bands, carrying wooden crosses and banners made of rags, marching south with a terrifying, wide-eyed certainty. At first, the movement seems almost beautiful, a testament to the simple faith of the people. But as the columns of marching peasants grow from hundreds to thousands, the dream turns into a nightmare. They are hungry, they are armed with knives and pitchforks, and they are angry. The crusade quickly devolves into a riot of the disenfranchised. When they are refused food by towns or monasteries, they attack. They storm the prisons of Paris, breaking open the Châtelet to release inmates. They massacre Jews in the south. They terrify the clergy. Philip the Tall, the king of order, is horrified. He sends his seneschals to disperse them. But how do you legislate against a mob that believes it is led by God? The statue king's son finds that his decrees are useless against a human flood. It takes months of bloody skirmishes, hangings, and military action to finally scatter the shepherds, leaving the roads of France lined with the bodies of young men who thought they were marching to Jerusalem but ended up in a ditch in Languedoc. But the fear does not die with the shepherds. It merely changes shape, twisting into something even more grotesque and paranoid. In the spring of 1321, a new whisper begins to travel from village to village, a conspiracy theory so dark that it reveals the depth of the medieval psyche's terror. People begin to say that the wells are poisoned. They claim that the lepers, the Meso, the outcasts who live in isolated colonies on the edge of society, have formed a secret brotherhood. The rumor is specific and terrifying. The lepers, bribed by the Jews and the Muslim king of Granada, have conspired to kill all healthy Christians by dropping sachets of poison made of human blood, urine, and consecrated hosts into the communal water sources. It is a preposterous lie, a fabrication born of anxiety and a need to explain the relentless waves of sickness and death that plague the land. But to a population that has lost faith in its leaders, it sounds like the truth. Historians still argue whether Philip the Tall actually believed this leper plot, or if he cynically used it as a pretext to seize the assets of the leper hospitals to fill his depleted treasury. The most charitable interpretation is that the king, usually so rational, was swept up in the same contagion of fear that gripped his subjects. Confronted with reports of poison powders found in wells and confessions extracted under torture, Philip issues an edict that is chilling in its bureaucratic cruelty. He orders that all lepers who confess to the crime be burned alive. Those who do not confess are to be imprisoned in their own hospitals, walled up in isolation. The result is a summer of smoke and screaming. Across France, the sky is darkened by the pyres of the sick. In some towns, mass executions take place where dozens of lepers, men and women whose only crime was a disfiguring disease, are herded into bonfires. It is a pogrom of the invalid, a moment where the society tries to burn away its own vulnerability. The king presides over this madness from a distance, but the strain is tearing him apart. Philip the Tall is a man who loves logic, yet he is ruling a kingdom that has gone insane. He works relentlessly, travelling from region to region, trying to inspect the administration, trying to hold the fabric of the state together with his own two hands. He wears himself down to a shadow. He is constantly plagued by fever, likely a recurrence of the dysentery that killed his brother, or perhaps the malaria that was endemic in the marshy parts of France. As the winter of 1321 approaches, the long king begins to fail. He retreats to the Abbey of Longchamp, seeking the quiet that he can never find in Paris. He is only 28 years old, but his hair is greying and his eyes are hollow. He knows, with the terrible clarity of the dying, that he has failed in the one task that mattered. He has no son. The curse has outmaneuvered him. He wrote the Salic law to save the crown for himself, and now that very law will strip the crown from his daughters. The end comes in January 1322. It is a cold, wet winter, the kind that seeps through the stone walls of the abbey. Philip lies in his bed, listening to the wind in the trees, perhaps thinking of the lepers he burned and the shepherds he hanged. He leaves a kingdom that is administratively stronger but spiritually broken, a land where neighbours look at each other with suspicion and where the water in the well is regarded with fear. On the 3rd of January, Philip the Tall dies, his brilliant mind silenced by the same mysterious frailty that took his father and brother. The curse has claimed its fourth victim. The transition of power that follows is a grim repetition of history, but this time there is no debate, no assembly of lawyers. The precedent is set. Philip's daughters, Joan, Margaret, Isabel, and Blanche, stand by their father's bier, weeping not just for his death, but for their own disinheritance. They are princesses of France, yet because of the law their father wrote, they are legally invisible. The crown bypasses them entirely and floats to the head of the last surviving son of the Iron King, Charles, the Count of La Marche. Charles IV, known as Charles the Fair, Charles le Bel, is the final hope of the Capetian dynasty. He is a handsome man, resembling his father in physical beauty, but he is described by contemporaries as rigid, slow, and intellectually dim. He is a man of limited imagination who suddenly finds himself in charge of a burning house. As he steps up to the throne, the people of France look at him with a mixture of pity and dread. They know the pattern now. The Iron King had 3 sons. 2 are dead, 1 remains. The slow camera of our story lingers on the coronation of Charles IV at Reims. The crowds are thinner this time. The cheers are muted. There is a sense of inevitable twilight. The curse has been methodical, picking off the heirs one by one, and now it has cornered the last brother. Charles stands before the altar, the heavy velvet of the coronation robe weighing down his shoulders, unaware that he is the last punctuation mark in a sentence that has been written for 300 years. The story of the knights is over, but the story of the fall is entering its final, quiet chapter. The countryside is silent now. The lepers are dead or hidden. The shepherds are buried, but the emptiness of the future is louder than any riot. The story now moves into the hushed and velvet-draped corridors of the Louvre, where the last son of the Iron King, Charles there, sits upon a throne that has become the most dangerous seat in Christendom. It is the year 1322, and the atmosphere in the court is one of stifling, anxious perfection. Charles is a man who seems, at first glance, to be the resurrection of his father. He has the same towering height, the same carved, statuesque features, and the same pale, unblinking blue eyes that unnerved ambassadors a decade ago. He is called Charles the Fair, Charles le Bel, and as he walks through the gallery, the courtiers bow low, struck by the uncanny resemblance. But the resemblance is only skin deep. Where Philip the Fair was a terrifying genius who bent the world to his will, Charles is merely a strict, exacting man who insists on following the rules. He is a bureaucrat in a king's body, a man who believes that if he simply enforces the laws rigidly enough, the chaos of the last few years will retreat. He cracks down on corruption. He audits the books. He chases away the Italian bankers again, and he banishes the Jews whom his brother had recalled. He is trying to sweep the floor while the roof is collapsing, unaware that the rot is not in the ledger, but in the blood. The tragedy of Charles IV is the tragedy of a man running a race he has already lost. His reign is defined by a single grinding obsession, the need for a son. The curse of the Templars has been frighteningly specific. It does not kill the Capetians immediately. It allows them to hope, and then it takes the future away. Charles begins his reign with a handicap that is a direct result of the family's dirty laundry. His wife, Blanche of Burgundy, is still a prisoner. Unlike her cousin Marguerite, who died in the cold of Chateau Gaillard, Blanche has survived her imprisonment, clinging to life in the dark cell of the fortress. She is technically the Queen of France, a title she holds while sleeping on straw, convicted of adultery in the Tower of Nesle scandal. For Charles, this is an intolerable mess. He cannot have a bastard-bearing adulteress as his queen, but he cannot marry another while she lives. Unlike his brother Louis, who perhaps let nature, or a pillow, take its course, Charles chooses the path of the lawyer. He seeks an annulment. He sends envoys to the new pope, John means an elderly, avaricious pontiff who is happy to oblige the French king for a price. The lawyers find a convenient loophole. They discover that Blanche's mother was Charles's godmother, creating a spiritual affinity that makes the marriage incestuous in the eyes of the church. It is a cynical fiction, but it works. The marriage is dissolved. Blanche is moved from her dungeon to a convent, where she dies a few years later, broken and forgotten, the last of the scandalous sisters to fade from the stage. Free at last, Charles rushes to remarry. He chooses Marie of Luxembourg, a woman of high birth and reported grace, the sister of the King of Bohemia. The wedding in 1322 is a desperate, joyous affair. The court holds its breath. They watch the Queen's waistline with the intensity of hawks. And then the miracle happens. Marie becomes pregnant. The king is ecstatic. He is young, he is healthy, and he is about to secure the succession. The nightmare of the cursed kings seems to be receding, but the curse has a way of turning accidents into destiny. In the spring of 1324, the king and queen are travelling near Issoudun. The royal carriage is a heavy lumbering thing, suspended on leather straps, moving over the uneven roads of the French countryside. Historians still argue about the cause: a broken wheel, a spooked horse, a patch of bad road, but the result is a catastrophe. The carriage overturns. The wood splinters. The pregnant queen is thrown violently. She is carried to a nearby castle, bleeding and in agony. There she goes into premature labour. She gives birth to a son, Charles. The boy lives for a few hours, just long enough to be baptized, just long enough to be a flicker of hope, and then he dies. His mother, crushed by the accident and the birth, follows him into the grave days later. The shock of this event is profound. It is not just a personal tragedy. It feels like a divine rejection. To lose a wife and an heir in a senseless traffic accident strikes the people of France as proof that the heavens are closed to the house of Capet. Charles is devastated. He is a man who plays by the rules, yet he is being punished like a criminal. He buries his wife and son, and the silence in the Louvre grows deeper. The king is 30 years old, but he is already the last brother. There are no more sons of Philip the Fair waiting in the wings. If Charles fails, the line ends. Driven by duty and a rising panic, Charles marries a third time. He does not look abroad for a princess. He looks to his own family, marrying his cousin, Jeanne d'Evreux. She is a small, pious, and intelligent woman who will go on to become one of the great art patrons of the century, the owner of the famous Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux, a tiny prayer book illuminated with scenes of delicate beauty. But Charles does not need an art collector. He needs a mother. Their marriage is affectionate, perhaps the only truly warm relationship in the final days of the dynasty. But it is haunted. Jeanne gives birth to a daughter. Then another daughter. The Salic Law, which Charles's brother wrote, mocks them from the archives. The girls are useless to the succession. As the years of his reign tick by, 1325, 1326, 1327, the tension in Europe begins to wind tight. While Charles struggles to produce an heir, his sister Isabella, the she-wolf, is tearing England apart. She invades her husband's kingdom, deposes him, and rules as regent for her son, young Edward III. This English boy, the grandson of the Iron King, is watching France with interest. He has a claim. If Charles dies without a son, Edward is the closest male relative. The irony is bitter. The Capetians wrote a law to keep women from the throne, but they cannot stop a woman, Isabella, from transmitting a claim to her son. The seeds of the 100 Years' War are germinating in the failure of Charles's nursery. By the winter of 1327, the end begins. Charles falls ill. It is Christmas, a time of nativity and birth, but the king is dying. He is only 33 years old, the same age as Alexander the Great, the same age as Christ, a number that medieval numerologists find deeply ominous. His illness is slow and debilitating, draining the strength from his tall frame, leaving him pale and bedridden in the palace of Vincennes, the same fortress where his brother Louis died and where his nephew John died. The walls of Vincennes seem to have absorbed the grief of the family, radiating a cold chill that no fire can warm. Jeanne d'Evreux sits by his bedside. She is pregnant again. It is the final, desperate roll of the dice. Charles, in his lucid moments, knows the stakes. If the child in her womb is a boy, the dynasty is saved. If it is a girl, the house of Capet is extinct. He summons his nobles, the great peers of France, to his deathbed. He whispers his final instructions. If the queen bears a son, he says, his voice a shadow of the royal command, he will be king. If she bears a daughter, the barons must choose who shall rule. It is a stunning admission of defeat. The king, who believed in rules and laws, is leaving his kingdom to the chaos of an election. He knows that his cousin, Philip of Valois, is waiting in the shadows, eager to seize the crown, but he also knows the English are watching. The curse of Jacques de Molay, spoken in the fire 14 years ago, has run its course with terrifying precision. It has dismantled the most powerful family in Europe, brick by brick, life by life. On February 1328, Charles the Fair takes his last breath. The hands that hold the crucifix are limp. The handsome face is still. The last brother is dead. The direct line of the Capetians, which began in the year 987 with Hugh Capet, has been severed. The sun has set on the dynasty. The courtiers back away from the bed, crossing themselves, looking at the pregnant queen with a mixture of pity and hunger. The king is dead, and there is no long live the king. There is only a terrifying silence and the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, blowing from the north where the English ships are waiting. The story of the knights has ended in the grave. The story of the war is about to begin in the womb. The final curtain falls not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet, devastating cry of a newborn in a room draped in black. It is April 1st, 1328. 2 months have passed since the death of Charles the Fair, and for those 60 days, the Kingdom of France has existed in a suspended animation, a breath held in the collective throat of the nation. The government is functioning on autopilot, the courts are stalled, and the great lords are pacing the corridors of the Louvre, their eyes fixed on the swollen belly of the widowed queen, Jeanne d'Evreux. She is the final vessel of the Capetian miracle, the last fragility standing between the stability of the past and the abyss of the future. The late king's will was clear. If she bears a son, the dynasty continues. If she bears a daughter, the book is closed. It is a terrifying burden for one woman to carry, knowing that the history of Europe is knitting itself together inside her womb. In the early hours of the morning, the labour ends. The midwives bustle. The regent, Philip of Valois, the tall, ambitious cousin who has been running the government while waiting for this moment, stands outside the door, likely gripping the hilt of his sword, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door opens. The announcement is made. It is a girl. Her name will be Blanche, a beautiful name for a child who enters the world as a ghost of a hope that didn't survive. With that single, small life, the direct line of the Capetian kings, the miracle of the dynasty that had produced an unbroken chain of fathers and sons since the year 987 is extinguished. The curse of the Templars has completed its work. In just 14 years, from the fire on the island in 1314 to the cradle in the Louvre in 1328, the most powerful family in Christendom has been wiped off the map. The Iron King, his 3 sons, and his grandson are all dead. The crown that was once firmly welded to the head of the Capetians is now rolling on the floor, waiting for the strongest hand to pick it up. The weeks that follow are a masterclass in political survival. The barons of France gather at Vincennes to decide the fate of the throne. The choice is stark. On one side stands Edward III of England, the 15-year-old nephew of the last king, the son of Isabella the she-wolf. By blood, he is the closest male relative, but he is English. He is the stranger. On the other side stands Philip of Valois, the cousin. His claim is weaker by blood, but stronger by geography. He is French. He is here. He is a man they know. The assembly invokes the Salic law once again, that convenient legal fiction Philip the Tall invented to save his own skin. They declare that a woman cannot transmit a right she does not possess. Because Isabella cannot be queen, she cannot pass the crown to her son Edward. It is a legalistic sleight of hand, a way to dress up xenophobia in the robes of justice. The barons raise their swords and acclaim Philip of Valois as King Philip II. The House of Valois is born. The House of Capet is dead. But history is not so easily cheated. Across the Channel, the young Edward III does not accept this verdict. He hears the news that his cousin has stolen his inheritance. He looks at the lions on his coat of arms. He waits. The decision made in the panic of 1328 will not bring peace, it will bring the 100 Years' War. The curse of Jacques de Molay, having destroyed the dynasty, is now about to set fire to the nation itself. The France that Philip the Fair tried to build, the centralized, wealthy, absolute state, is about to be torn apart by a century of English invasions, plague, and civil strife. The 13th generation of the curse, it turns out, was not a count of people, but a measurement of the enduring misery that would befall the kingdom that burned the knights. Yet, as we stand at the end of this long, winding road, looking back at the ruins of the Templar order and the royal family, the feeling is not one of anger, but of a profound, melancholy stillness. The slow camera of our narrative pulls back now, rising up through the roof of the palace, up into the cool spring air of 1328. We see the city of Paris spread out below, smaller and darker than the city we know, a maze of wood and stone clustered around the cathedrals. We see the river Seine, the silent witness to it all, flowing past the Ile des Juifs. The stake is long gone. The ashes have washed away to the sea. The island is empty, just a patch of mud and grass where the ducks rest in the evening. We drift north to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. We float through the stone walls into the dim, cool quiet of the royal crypt. Here they lie, the players in our tragedy, carved in marble, their hands joined in eternal prayer. We see Philip the Fair, beautiful and cold even in death. We see Louis the Quarreller, Philip the Tall, and Charles the Fair. They are together now, their quarrels silenced, their ambitions turned to dust. They lie next to the fathers they disappointed and the wives they wronged. In the silence of the crypt, the curse does not matter. The gold does not matter. The power does not matter. They are simply men who lived and feared and died like any other. The story of the Templars and the kings is a tragedy of hubris, a reminder that the higher the tower, the harder the fall, but it is also a story of the relentless, indifferent passage of time. The fire burns out, the screams fade, the dynasties crumble, and what remains is the land, the river, and the whisper of a story told in the dark. The knights are gone, but their legend survives, woven into the very fabric of the history they helped to shape. They have become the guardians of a different kind of temple now, the temple of memory, where they stand watch over the dreams of a world that has long since moved on. The fire has dimmed to a single glowing ember, and the long gallery of kings and knights has faded into the velvet folds of the night. We have walked the stone corridors of history together, from the misty dawn of the raid to the quiet sunset of the dynasty, witnessing the rise and fall of men who thought they could command the tides of fate. Now the shouting is over. The heavy doors of the Louvre are closed. The ledgers are shut. The wind that howled around the Tower of Nesle has softened into a gentle breeze that rustles the leaves of the forest, a lullaby whispered by the earth itself. Let the weight of the dates and the names slip away from your mind. They are just shadows now, resting in the peace of the past. You are safe here, far from the intrigues of court and the cold of the dungeon. There is only the warmth of your bed, the steady rhythm of your breathing, and the comfortable darkness that wraps around you like a soft, heavy blanket. The river Seine flows on, carrying the memories to the sea, cleansing the stones, smoothing the rough edges of the world. History is a river that flows into the ocean of dreams. Let yourself drift on that current. The kings are sleeping. The knights are at rest. The world has turned, and it is time for you to turn with it, away from the waking world and into the quiet, starless sky of sleep. Let go. The story is done. The night is yours.